Does anything else hit, like, ice-cold caffeine in a deli container before service?
Chef. These look different.
Oh, yeah, I made the margins wider.
Why?
Because you write in the margins.
It's really nice. Thank you.
I gotta get it off my wall here really quick. So if you can see this is a per se tasting menu. I'll pop one up on screen. These menus are taped down to the pass during service. And so at the end of the night, when it's time to write the tasting menu for the next day, and I've talked about this in other videos in the context of dish creation, it's easier to not start from scratch. I talk about building a garden of inspiration, and this is just one example of that, where you're basically starting with the previous day's menu, and you're saying, hey, what do we want to change about this menu versus the blank cursor effect, where you're basically like, let's start from scratch. And Sydney's talking about it with Carmen in his creative process. I certainly noticed it in the chef de cuisines that I spent time with at both Per Se and the French Laundry, because the chef de parties, we would get these like matrices to fill out. The chef de cuisine would print off multiple of them. We would get a bunch of them, and they would kind of have these placeholders that would include the dishes that we would have to be responsible for the next day. But in Carmen's example, I think he's talking about what I would see the chef de cuisines doing, which is this kind of like very messy process. Because I know that we hold this standard in high regard for the entire menu changing at these restaurants from day to day, but there are some examples where like the fish might stay the same, or we might do lobster again as the shellfish. And so that might happen where the set just gets crossed out, but then you'll circle lobster just so that in your mind, as you're bouncing all of these ideas around, you kind of know where certain things are. And then you'll also do the thing where you might move ingredients from one dish to another. And as I've shared before, when it's 1 a.m. and this is the time when your blood sugar is low and your adrenaline is just starting to subside, you want all of that contained onto one sheet. You don't want to be flipping between a bunch of different pieces of paper as you're writing the menu for the next day.
Coke.
Check. Ticket's good?
Yeah, check. Sharpie?
Check.
We're good. You good?
Good.
All right. We're open.
I'm maybe going to call BS on Carmen's Sharpie check that he did on Sydney. I don't necessarily know if that's all that realistic, but Richie coming to Sydney and asking, you good? And then she asking the same to him is absolutely something that's realistic that will happen in the dynamic of like the person who's standing at the pass and the person who's basically in charge of making sure the front of house team is getting people seated. It's even common language in the industry. This episode is called doors, and that's also something that you'll see people say in the context of like doors are open, or doors, like you got to be cognizant of the fact that like we're going from this stage of where prep is happening and we're not taking care of people, the kind of like the hospitality is off, and then all of a sudden we have to kind of like turn it on. We have to be aware of the fact that like people might be taking pictures, people are being able to talk to us and have conversations, and they're looking to be taken care of here. This is also beneficial because if any one of these answers were to have been no, let's say for example Sydney were to say no, the bread isn't ready, or one of our initial canapes is not ready to be fired yet, then at least Richie knows that, and then he can do something about the steps of service to potentially like redirect people's attention or stall to make sure that the experience still stays as good as it can possibly be for the guests that come and join them.
You want to call it?
Your turn, chef.
Doors!
Yeah, doors, yep. And then you'll get the callback where everybody basically acknowledges that service has started. At any point, tickets can start to fire. Doors are open.
Of note is the asparagus. Looks really awesome. That's served with quail egg and a turnip puree.
Potato.
Oh, okay. That's served with a potato and turnip puree.
Egg and potato.
Asparagus is served with a quail egg and a potato puree.
So if you've been in the situation where you're sitting at the table and the front of house person just explained a dish to you and something doesn't seem quite right, you just saw an example of how like that game of telephone can potentially go awry. That's why I love focusing on communication so much in these environments. Secondly, a big part of the kind of standardizing of how ingredients are treated in some of these restaurants is why you can have these on-the-fly adjustments that I've kind of talked about in other videos, where potato puree, if you have been around this restaurant for longer than, let's say, 3 months, or you've gone through some sort of training and onboarding, you kind of know how that chef or that culinary team likes to treat XYZ ingredient. And so it's not really that new or novel to basically switch from a, potato tuile to a potato puree. As long as you can kind of like see that ingredient represented on the plate in one way, shape, or form, you pretty much understand how to describe that or spiel that to the guest. I also really wanted to touch on Marcus's contribution to this pre-service meeting really quick, and shout out in the comments if you are a pastry chef and you can let me know where I'm getting some of this stuff right, where I'm getting this stuff wrong. But I think that there's 3 kind of key key points here that Marcus brings up in the context of how a pastry chef navigates this type of culinary program. And so you saw Marcus basically confirming that dishes that he had already developed that were already on the menu, just reconfirming that these were going to be on the menu, which kind of stands in contrast with what Carmen is doing, where he's changing the menu every day and sets are changing and ingredients are changing and the placement of different dishes on the tasting menu are changing. Marcus is basically saying, no update from my end, everything is basically the same. Pastry dishes, whether it's cakes or ice cream bases or custards, they typically take a little bit longer to do the research and development side on. And once you have something, you're not really incentivized to change it, right? Because if you get the texture right on a spuma or a semi-Fredo is like exactly where you want it, you don't need to make any of those little micro adjustments. You just kind of want to continue to actually leverage that IP that you have generated and just continue to use it into the future. And the reason you don't get more time to do R&D is because of the ratio of staffing from the savory side of the menu to the sweet side. And on this kitchen, I think it's like 4-to-1 or something like that. There's 4 savory cooks to 1 Marcus. And so he's just one guy. And so when is he going to have time to do more R&D stuff? And so if his menu items were changing every day, they would need to staff more. And that's actually a constraint that the restaurant has, as they're trying to keep costs low. And so being able to actually prep and stay ahead of his menu items means that Marcus can just be the one to run that station. And the third thing that I've often seen, especially on the restaurants that really prioritize seasonality, is the fact that you want Pastry Station to basically like have their ingredients that they're using, because remember, we're not repeating ingredients on this menu, as you've seen in other episodes from the non-negotiables. And Marcus basically wants to plant his flag and say, I'm using strawberry, or I'm using tarragon, or I'm using hibiscus. And then everybody basically knows, okay, that's not something we can touch at least for the next like 2 or 3 months. And then Marcus has the peace of mind knowing that he's not going to come in the next day and Carmen's basically going to say, you can't use fennel on this dish that you're using because I'm deciding to use it. And so that creates this really interesting line in the sand where Marcus feels that his ingredients are protected. And then Marcus, when it comes to his prep, has the confidence that he can prep ahead, because then he can keep things in dry storage. He can keep things in the freezer. He can cryovac things and keep them for the future. And so I don't want to paint with too broad of a brush, but you will often see pastry programs evolving a little bit less frequently than culinary ones do.
Okay, order in, 2 top, no shellfish, no gluten. Chef. Fire, 2 mirrors.
All right, quick anatomy of how Sydney is expediting here, just to kind of give some insight into how this works. So she'll do the order in, basically like letting everybody know that there's a new ticket that has come in, and that's kind of like an important action item so that the line knows that this is not kind of like picking up something that's already existing. This will often fire people into motion on different things. So like I can see on the ticket here that there's like 2 beef here that is on this menu. And so when this ticket comes in, the person who's on that station might pull 2 steaks out of their lowboy to ultimately start tempering, or get whatever processes in motion need to happen when a new ticket comes in, so that they don't ever get blindsided with the fact that you basically have lead time as tickets come in. And the next thing she's going to talk about is how many and who is it for, like what did they order is kind of the next thing that happens. And so you'll hear her talking about 2 top, 4 top. I don't expedite that way. I haven't worked in restaurants where you use the 2 and 4 top. What you more often hear is like, what type of menu did they order? Is there an a la carte option? Is it 2 for the bar, or 2 tasting, or 2 veg, 2 chef's tasting? It kind of like that will dictate more kind of like what comes after. You won't use the word top. And so what I've more often done in the past is order in for 2. And then that last thing that you say is what is called back from the line. And that's done so that you have clarity on everybody heard the right number. I've also seen kitchens before where regardless of what is said from the expediter, the response is like a we or a yes chef that comes back. And I think that's fine, but you can kind of, again, sometimes have this discombobulation game of telephone where you thought you heard something and it actually is something else, and then that can cause confusion down the line. This is also very close to my preference when it comes to writing tickets down. I'll start with the good and then we'll go into the bad. The good is that you have kind of like every single dish that is okay for the person who has a gluten-free and shellfish allergy is basically marked on the ticket here. And so you can see 2 mirepoix, 2 cauliflower, but then you get to this next dish and you say 1 of this dish and then 1 of whatever I would call out of place dish is, whatever the substitution is, so that it's very clear for the expediter when they're calling that out. If they're especially combining with other tables, they can say 1 hamachi and then 1 whatever this is. I can't read it when I have it paused here. That's why it's so helpful to do this, what I call out of place planning. I teach this in Total Station Domination, and so that the front of house person, like this is the first ticket of the night. It's fine when you have all that time and Carmen's literally just standing there twiddling his spoon to basically have the conversation of how are we going to do a substitution here. But when you're 18 tickets deep and then all of a sudden you have a new ticket that comes in that has some sort of allergy that you haven't planned for, that's what causes some of those problems. And so having that plan in place before service even starts is what I recommend. It looks like they've done that here. So like 2 thumbs up for that. What I don't like, or what I kind of picked up on, at least as the person who would be working the station here, is that she didn't specify that there was just one person who was no gluten, no shellfish. And so Richie did a really good job of saying the person at P2, and so we talked about the floor plan map where all the individual tables are in the past. Those also have signifiers for position numbers. And so that also helps to be able to know, I'm going P1, P2, you're going P3, P4, if you're walking food with somebody else, so that you don't have this awkward thing where you get to the table and you're kind of like, you're tripping over each other's feet with where you're going to place the bowl that you're going to ultimately set down. And so that also lets the person know of, if you're going to take this one hamachi, one whatever it is, to table 17 that's here on the ticket, you know exactly where that person is. And so you're not flip-flopping, because if you're just going to guess, like, you have a 50-50 shot of getting it wrong. And so again, there's a lot that went right with this first ticket call out. I know it's early days and maybe they're trying to show that there's a little bit of some of these inefficiencies that they could potentially work on. But if I were to improve this, or the way that I kind of try to give advice for some of you folks who have asked, like, I've just stepped into an expediting role, I'm trying to be a high performer in this position, how do I think about this? The way that I would approach this, if I was really to try to like Kaizen, get a little bit better at this every single day, the way that I would approach this is order in for 2, and then you get the call back from the team, and then you say, I have 1 guest, no gluten, no shellfish. And then you basically, like, if you want to take it a step further as an expediter, whoever station this is with the hamachi and the ravioli, you can give a heads up to that person of like, hey, just so you know, I know we talked about this before service, and that this is part of the out of place plan, but it's going to be 1 hamachi, 1 blank. And it's going to be 1 ravioli, 1 blank on this table. Is a really effective way to, again, just make sure you're on the same page here, because in the swirl of you're trying to manage all your prep and you're trying to, you know, like you might be still finishing up your prep as you're getting ready for service and getting set up. It is that just little gentle reminder that the expediter can give to the person working the station. You just want to ensure that when it comes time to pick up the hamachi and whatever this out of place is, the person who's running that station is ready and doesn't get caught with their pants down. You'll also notice that she immediately fires the mirepoix, and that is helpful because there's nothing that comes before the mirepoix, kind of by definition of it being the first course on the tasting menu, right? But there might also be some communication that happens where Richie might need to do, like, there needs to be a cocktail that needs to be made first, or maybe they're waiting for certain people to arrive at the table, or maybe there's a little bit of a, like, they're doing presents or something at the table because it's somebody's birthday right before everything happens. And so you can do the order in part, but because there's no kind of like, with mirepoix, once the mirepoix is fired and it walks, you can basically know that you're out on the cauliflower dish that comes after. But because the mirepoix comes first, it will be the thing that she will actively call and fire, basically, to have that be picked up as soon as that table is ready. Last thing that I personally notice on the tickets is that she is doing this tracking method of using the highlighter and the Sharpie. That is a great way of doing things, where basically, like, as things are fired, you basically know that, like, I have asked for this from the station, and so you can highlight that, and so you can basically do a quick scan when you have 12 tickets on your rail here. You can basically kind of see, like, what are all of the outstanding orders that I have. If we were to mirror this to another kind of like Kanban board style view of something, you can see all the things that I've requested from the kitchen brigade, and then you can basically, like, as they get picked up, as they walk, you use the Sharpie to cross it out, and then you mark the time in this column. And so that's a really effective way, even as the timings are seemingly disconnected. It's also really helpful if you're combining tables where this is the first ticket, and so we're going to try to get this out as quickly as possible, but then also as the flow starts to, you know, compound and get a little bit more complex, you might be picking up 6 asparagus at the same time based on where different people are at in their tasting menu.
4 mirepoix.
Chef.
Might they be trying to show that he's, like, still a little bit green and he's still trying to do some skill development things here? Maybe. This kind of mirrors, like, if you were to kind of like pan into the kitchen and show somebody like struggling how to hold a knife or something like that. Like, this person has opened enough wine bottles to not have to struggle with corks or corkscrews. And especially, like, if this was a particularly old bottle of wine and the cork is really fragile and they're trying, like, I can kind of just see based on the bottle that they're opening that this is not the case. And so I'm going to call a little bit of a BS on this kind of like struggling to open the wine bottle here as part of this scene.
Shit. Ah, fuck.
Yo, Chef Sid, I need those Wagyu. These guys are waiting like half an hour.
Right here, Jeff.
Perfect.
Thank you, Chef Tina.
Thank you.
No, T, refire, please. Everybody take your time.
No, T, do not refire. Plate that shit. Plate it.
What's
Cook is
wrong
off.
with it?
Are you fucking kidding me? It's perfect.
The cook's off. Refire.
That's a fucking asshole right there. I'm getting fucked.
If it's not perfect, it doesn't go out.
Yeah?
Okay?
Why don't you...
The tension of this moment, if you spend enough time in restaurants, you have encountered this feeling in some way, shape, or form, which is you need to get something out, food takes time, and there's a quality standard that we're trying to meet as we're delivering an experience to people. Even on the guest side, if you've been in the shoes of whatever table this happens to be, where you're waiting 30 minutes for your next course, you don't always see what is happening behind the scenes that causes that wait to need to happen. And it could be a number of reasons. The person working that station could have cut their hand or burned themselves and they had to go offline for a little bit, and there's like nobody running the station because everybody else is too busy, and so everything on that station is just starting to pile up and get really unnecessarily behind. Maybe they ran out of some prep and they actually needed to pause. They can't do any more pickups because they're having to prep more cauliflower or something like that. Even more extreme, maybe you run out of cauliflower and you have to go to the store, you have to leave the station, and then maybe Carmen's going to work your station while you're at the store. That also doesn't, like, just because somebody can jump in and work your station doesn't mean I can get the cauliflower dish out any faster because I don't have any cauliflower to cook for you. And then a really debilitating feeling. The reason in the last episode we talked about everything worships at the feet of the protein is because of what we're seeing in this scene. And so I'm actually taking Carmen's side in this scene because the way that I'm noticing everybody's body language and the way that the conversation happened, from Tina's eyes to Richie starting to kind of like make excuses or just, oh, it's fine, just brush it off. Carmen has set clear qualities for what he wants to see in the temperature of the beef when it's cooked. You can insert a myriad of different reasons why Tina didn't hit it on this beef execution when she goes and passes up that steak. It's the beef courts. It's the last thing you're going to enjoy before moving into Sweetland, and chances are it's the thing you're kind of like looking forward to as probably the most expensive protein that you're going to eat as part of this tasting menu. It's got to be right. And it's like there's so many facets to this problem, right? Because yes, it's going to take even more time for a table that's already been waiting to get another beef course fired. I've talked about it in other videos where she would basically, in the context of like, if you're really actually busy, what you'll typically do is like you'll take the next beef that you already have maybe resting on your tray, and you'll actually just kind of move that forward on your timeline, serve that to this two-top, and then you'll pull out another one and then ultimately fire that for something that you have maybe coming further down on your timeline. That's not even talking about the fact that, like, what if you are typically known as the place who serves the beef at a super consistent temperature, and you've been promoting the way that you prepare your beef and the way that you source it. I'm using the beef as an example. This can apply to anything, but all of a sudden you get a steak that looks different than everything that you've ever seen marketed on the way that the beef is served at this restaurant. And you're looking at your phone, and then you're looking at what's on your plate, and you're looking back at your phone, and you're saying, I don't think this is right. You run the risk of, if you send that steak out, of that guest just kind of like waving down a server and saying, hey, I think that our beef is a little bit overcooked here. And then all of a sudden, now what are you going to say, right? Because now the beef comes back, and now you really have to refire again. And now you kind of have this awkward thing of like, you tried to pass off the beef that is technically not right on whatever guest that happened to be. And the problem is, like, I talk about this as if it's something obvious, but this happens all the time. Things get sent out that like aren't quite right. They don't align with the clear qualities that the person in the leadership position has laid out for the staff. If the person at the table doesn't know that that's an overcooked piece of beef, they'll eat it and they'll enjoy it and they'll just like go on with their day and it's fine. Like they didn't even notice. And so like on one hand, I get it why people continue to do it. It doesn't make it any better. And also you hear the argument of like the food waste part of like, you had this really expensive piece, did you really need to throw it in the trash? Could we have saved it for something else? Maybe, but it is one of those funny things where like at a place that's trying to operate at this caliber, any little crack or, you know, kind of like blemish in the foundation of the way that just the main product of this restaurant, the food, goes out, it starts to really ripple, and it starts to turn into this thing where everything else all of a sudden starts to get a pass, and then all of a sudden the standards go down, and then it's this negative spiral, and then you can ultimately end up in this place where you're like, I'm not actually happy with how my restaurant looks right now. I won't rehash some of the things I've talked about in other videos, like you need to kind of be on a high skill level to work a protein station or anything like that, but like I've worked in kitchens before where if you overcook the Wagyu, you get sent home. Like it is just a thing that just does not happen, and so that's why this scene kind of like particularly hit me hard.
Richie.
Oh, you guys are fucking me. No, for real.
Are they drinking?
They're drinking.
Okay, let's do a glass on us. As many glasses, please.
And so if you do decide that you're going to prioritize high standards over anything else, and that's going to come at the expense of time, having to refire things, having to tell people that they did it wrong and they need to do it again. And so you're seeing here at that fork in the road, are we going to send the steak or are we not? We decided we're going to not send this steak. We're going to refire a new one. And so now you're faced with some of these solves that people have, which are these kind of like stalls or kind of like experience modifiers that you can add in to make sure that it is not not this kind of like big hiccup moment, or you're just being sat there waiting for your steak to basically come out. And so these take the shape of multiple things. Sydney's talking about like, give a free glass of wine. And so we're going to send a som over and we're going to say, hey, I know you guys have tried XYZ wine. Would you like to actually have something else that's going to be a part of the pairing that's normally on the thing that you guys didn't order, but I really want you to try this. And then that ultimately is this kind of like saving face that is going to cost more, right? Because we noticed that you already lost food cost on the beef. Now you're going to lose wine cost, quote unquote, because you're giving a free glass of alcohol. That is this other thing that is expensive, quote unquote, that you would normally make margin on. Other things that I've seen in the past is giving something like a kitchen tour. And so your beef actually needs a little bit more time. I don't like front of house people can correct me if I'm wrong here. I don't think it's actually bad to give the heads up of why you're doing the stall, but sometimes guests just like to know that they need a little bit more time on things. And that can ultimately be something where sometimes the communication doesn't happen enough. And then that causes that feeling of kind of like, why is it taking so long? Because the front of house doesn't want to admit that there's a problem with XYZ thing in the restaurant. It might not even be the front of house's fault, right? It's not Richie's fault that the steak was overcooked. That's the onus is on Tina there. And, you know, you can maybe put the onus on Sydney that she trained Tina to cook this protein. XYZ. We can point fingers in all sorts of different directions. But something like a kitchen tour is a really interesting thing of like, your beef is resting now. In the meantime, would you like to tour the wine cellar? Something like that, depending on what you have on site for people. The other thing that I've seen in the past is like additional courses. And so if maybe there's a 4-course tasting menu and a 7-course tasting menu, and you've ordered the 4-course, we actually have a little bit of wiggle room on courses from the 7-course that might be a little bit faster to fire, that as you're waiting for your steak, we know it's going to take 20 minutes to fire a new one. Can we take something from the 7-course and add it as a supplemental course? And that gives us 15 minutes of wiggle room where you actually won't ultimately end up noticing. That's also something that is quite effective to be able to make sure that people still, again, have a good experience, even though you had a mishap or a mistake. I'm not the type of person who's going to say like every single experience needs to be flawless, but you ultimately have more tools at your disposal as you get more skilled, as you develop your repertoire more, so that you have the ability to actually have more high quality execution, regardless of what happens and as problems arise. I wouldn't be holding the deli, probably be plating with 2 hands if I could.
Hands.
I have a couple of example tutorials on the other channel that talks about plating layouts and how I would potentially make this slightly more efficient by not plating with just 1 hand, but 2. I think for this step where it's just like, it's fairly quick to kind of like just take a bundle of what looks like seaweed and you put it on top of the king crab and then it ends up walking. The language that you'll sometimes hear in situations like this is seaweed and go. And what that basically tells the person who is being called for hands to stand at the pass and take this dish is, what's the finishing move? What's the final touch that the chef is going to put on this plate before I have the ability to walk it? And then that sometimes lets you know that once I see that the seaweed is on the crab, it's ready to go, because that can often cause this mismanagement of, when do I have the ability to take this dish, where things sometimes can go too soon, right? Like I thought the king crab needed to hit the dish and then it needed to go, but the chef actually knew that the seaweed needed to hit the crab first. And then you can have this mismatch of 2 people at the table have seaweed on their crab and 2 people don't. And that's because the person was a little bit too overeager in taking that plate. And so having that language of seaweed and go lets Carmen know that he is the ultimate one to have the last eyes on the plate, to put that finishing move on, and now the thing is ready to go. It can also go in the reverse direction, where the seaweed is on the crab, and the front of house is just standing there thinking that there's another step that needs to happen, and so you'll often give that heads up of, when the seaweed goes on the king crab, it's ready to go. That can ultimately be really helpful. The other thing that you'll see being played out here that I teach in Total Station Domination is this idea of like an order of operations assembly line. And so you'll notice here that Carmen is not finishing one dish and sending it out. He's getting asparagus on the plate first, then he's putting king crab on, he's doing these nice perky dots of whatever this puree happens to be, and then he's coming all the way down the line and doing seaweed and go. And that tends to be really helpful from an efficiency standpoint, so that when you call for hands, everybody can leave at the same time.
$11,268 for butter. Buddy, what is it, the fucking rare Transylvanian 5-titted goat? We cannot fucking keep this up.
It's Orwellian.
It's dystopian butter?
What?
What are you talking about?
No. Orwell, Vermont.
Orwell, Vermont.
Yes.
Of course. I'm gonna send him 20 fucking grand.
It's the best.
Oh, yeah.
I'm very overdue in getting a newsletter out about this. You can sign up in the link in the description. It's free to sign up, and I send one out every single week. And so I'll talk about it here, this kind of like removal of arbitrage when you use quality products when it comes to restaurant businesses. And I'll roughly talk about it here, and we can maybe have a conversation in the comments, and that might dictate what I end up deciding to ultimately write about. And it's basically this idea of most people want to have a perception of value when they're going out and paying for something. I don't know, you take my phone, for example, right? Like I have this iPhone. Phones used to be a little bit cheaper, right? Like you used to be able to buy a phone for $500-600. Now it's like $1,200 to get a brand new phone. And so you have this funny thing where like the costs are ultimately going down because they have economies of scale, and they're able to kind of like through consistency, through market penetration, through more features that they layer onto it, they make it more and more valuable. And so they ultimately allow that profitability to grow over time. And if I had to guess, it's partially like an ignorance of the consumer, right? Like I don't know, the metal on the port of my iPhone is a little bit different than the metal, the titanium that's going around the iPhone. I don't know what metal that is. Nobody had to tell me about that metal. And so my ignorance is a potential opportunity for the company that's making the thing. Same thing with like the parts under the hood of a car or the metal that's used in a particular watch. But in restaurants, when every single dish and every single component is getting spieled to you, you have two opposing forces that are working against you as the chef, basically, where one is if you use cheaper ingredients, it is like you care less, like you're not putting as much into the guest, or you're sacrificing some element of quality to it. And then if you do the higher end thing where you ultimately decide to buy the Wagyu, you decide to buy the truffles, you get the expensive shellfish, or you decide you want to use butter from Vermont, you pay more for the thing that you're going to bring in, which is often done at a markup because it is like there's margin that's being squeezed out of ultimately you to make that purveyor a little bit more profit, which I'm totally fine with. I don't have a problem with purveyors or producers making profit. I'm just saying from the chef's perspective, that puts us in a very big pickle, because if we're paying 3 times as much for something, can we now charge 3 times as more for that thing? Or does that sticker shock, by the time we've done all the multiplication, it comes out as this like totally exorbitant thing on the other side for the consumer? And so I guess the TLDR of what I'm trying to say is the pursuit of increased quality does not always increase profit for some of these businesses that are really trying to like bring in the best stuff and use the best stuff. And if they don't, you'll often see some of these businesses lose margin in other ways where their costs go up because maybe they don't bring in such expensive butter, but then they want to infuse it with something, or they want to shape it into a specific mold and have that be the presentation thing where it's like, yeah, it's not that expensive of an ingredient, but we're going to actually spend a lot more to put this on the table and make it more impressive in other ways. And then that turns into something where you're looking at your labor costs and you're like, yeah, my food cost is really low, but my labor cost made it so that like we didn't end up profitable at the end of the month. Just another example of why these businesses are so hard. And again, because like we did the math on the number of seats that the bear is going to seat at any given evening, and it's like they don't have the economies of scale that can make up for, or even the purchase orders that they can make to drive down the prices of whatever it is that they're buying, because they, even if they were to be able to buy 10,000 pounds of more butter, it doesn't turn into something where they can just serve that in the next week or two, because then they'd have to worry about storage, right? And so there's all sorts of problems that start to layer onto this. I'm just so struck by the fact that some of these problems that are solved by other industries cannot be implemented in restaurants like this due to scale constraints, due to perishability constraints. I think the only idea that I've maybe had that circumnavigates this or tries to get around it is my don't make it in-house piece that I did. I'll link it below in the description if you want to read that after this video.
Suck me.
Shout out to the dishwashers, man. I think like this whole scene is just a kind of an over exaggeration in a couple of ways of the, you know, trials and tribulations that go into the day of running a restaurant. And I think working in a restaurant, I think that some of the glitz and the glamour of opening night kind of like start to subside. And then you really start to realize like this is just, I show up, I do the thing, I prep for service, I do service, I scrub down, I go home. And you just have all of these, like, as you're multitasking, the pot boils over. The sheen starts to fade on some of the pots and pans, and you just have puree splatters on the Bain Maries now all of a sudden. And again, this is a slight over-exaggeration. I think with the standards that Carmen has set, that turns into something where that also creates attention now, because there's so much maintenance that's required in keeping your station in what I call the tidiest state, that it turns into something where, oh my goodness, I have to do this again. You spend so much of your time cleaning, and especially when you don't have the ability to develop a consistent routine and chefs throwing new dishes at you, and you don't quite know that if you left this pot with this amount of puree on this stove, on this setting, it was going to boil over, and now you're 18 minutes behind because you had to, scrub everything down, and you had to take everything off, and you had to wipe everything down, and now you have to restart the thing. Now that turns into something where you ultimately start to almost develop a resentment towards the work that you're doing on a day-to-day basis. I think most of you folks know the stories of Will Guidara from 11 Madison Park doing these over-the-top presentations and just kind of he calls them unreasonable hospitality moments for guests as he was running the front of house program there as general manager. But it's worth reading. It's a fantastic book that covers a lot of principles that kind of further cement some of the things on setting the table. We talked about Will having a role in producing the show. He shows up in other episodes later down the track in this season. It's just cool to actually see it brought to life on screen because there are so many of these industry stories that, for all intents and purposes, we don't have any video evidence of them ever happening. And so that to see them codified and cemented in the zeitgeist in this way, I think is really, really cool. I think I might leave it to other front of house folks in the comments to potentially talk about the non-negotiables and how those actually come to life in whatever restaurant you happen to be working at that Richie just talked about. I think the cooler thing to be able to see playing out on screen here is him actually taking charge and wanting to kind of say, I want to leave my thumbprint on the way that this restaurant runs and the way that we treat guests and the way that we go above and beyond and provide an experience for folks in a way where last season, when he was a little bit more timid and would never have taken charge, didn't quite know what he wanted and where he wanted to go with things. I think that transformation is really palpable here.
No, I hate this.
For a surprise?
No, fuck surprises.
Why?
Fuck surprises.
I love surprises.
No.
You'd love a surprise.
Yes, fucking surprise!
Richie, no surprise!
Yes!
I'm going to hammer it home here again, just in case I'm not being abundantly clear. I know I talk about total station domination a lot. I know I talk about being a high performer, and I know we're seeing them being exaggerated, but the reality is mistakes happen. And as you progress throughout your career, the frequency of them definitely goes down and down and down. You're not experiencing them as regularly. But I think the more important thing to keep in mind is kind of the bounce back from them, your ability to kind of rebound from something bad happening to you. The skill of taking preventative measures so that if something ended up happening, you might need to ask a couple more questions, or you might need to set your station up in a different way, or you might need to not do so many things at the same time. Because anybody who's going to look at you with a straight face and tell you that they went their entire career completely unblemished and unscathed, yeah, right, you're kidding yourself. And so the reason I bring this up is because I think people look at mistakes that are happening frequently and early on in their career as this kind of negative. There's a lot of negative self-talk that goes into some of those moments. It's I'm not good enough. I've said it before. I'll say it again. It's how you respond that matters.
Drop pasta in the pot. Okay, sauce in the pan. Yep. All right, and just reduce.
Man, everybody talks about the violent pot throwing scenes in shows like this, but these are the scenes that just sting the most if you've ever lived through something like this in a professional kitchen. I'll couch this with, this is how I perceived this scene playing out. If you saw something different, please let me know in the comments. I think what we're seeing here is almost a flashback to season 1, where Carmen had to give the lecture to Sydney about how to make demi-glace, I think is what was happening on screen. Or maybe there was an example with the blender, right? Here's how to use the blender. You have to put the thing on, make sure that it's all the way off. Or maybe that was the example that I gave. I couldn't quite remember. But now you see the same thing happening when Sydney's talking to Tina, and she's saying, you just have to ladle this in, and you just have to reduce it. And it's Tina knows how to do it. Again, I'm perceiving it as something happened in service where the sauce was broken, or the pasta broke, and the yolk came out, or something like that. And it is this problem of Tina's actually struggling with deeper problems. It is not the technique of picking up a pasta or the setup of, I need to have any of these individual pots in different places and I have too much or too little water in here. I'm using the wrong size ladle. I'm picking it up in a pot that is overcrowded or something like that. So it's if it's not a setup problem and it's not an instructions problem, aka related to tasks, what are some other things that could be causing this ailment of Tina to happen? I know that Sydney talks about not doing too many, taking your time. Maybe there's a time management problem that's happening here. That's why in Total Station Domination, I talk about the 9 domination measures. It's not just one thing that's causing a problem. And that's why teams actually get a lot of value from the program is because it allows you to manage a little bit more granularly on exactly what it is that's causing any individual team member problems. But like, again, shameless self-promo there because like it's a tool I wish I had. I also think it maybe comes back to the way that leadership is structured in these types of kitchens. Again, I'm a big proponent of this way of structuring your kitchen. I'm not bashing it in any way, shape, or form, but I think it is the situation where it's Tina's execution, but Sydney is ultimately responsible for the results in a lot of ways because the fingers will be pointed at Sydney. And it's weird because Sydney is so far removed from the, like doing the pickups, setting up the station. In a lot of ways, Tina has the ability to kind of make some of those adjustments. And if something is wrong, then the person to step in is Sydney. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is I wish sometimes these situations were met with a little bit more curiosity and maybe questions for Tina to maybe allow her to find an answer that fits better rather than, again, this like very top down, just kind of like, if the technique is the problem, then yes, let's talk about technique. But sometimes it's deeper than that.
Hey, you got it?
Yes, chef.
Good. Go.
Okay.
Careful. Thank you, chef.
Thank you. Hi, welcome. This is a broth from Chef Carmen's Mind, mirepoix and broth. I pour it in front of you.
Objectively, one of the funniest scenes the Bear has ever done. I know people push back in saying that this is like a comedy show, or it's like categorized as a comedy. So incredibly funny. It's made even funnier by the fact that we've covered it in previous episodes too, the fact that Matty Matheson has like restaurants of his own, which is just like so funny that they made him play out this scene. I think so many of us have been in the green shoes of chef just asked me to do something, gave me very specific instructions. I've never done it before. And maybe there's this extra layer of I have to go out and do it in front of a guest, or I have to do a tasting in front of somebody, or I have to, again, work this with this really expensive thing. And I'm just nervous. And so you get in your head, you overthink it, you forget steps, and it can be this really embarrassing way to learn. But you come out the other side of some of these stories and you can just kind of like empathize with people further. The one that comes to mind the most for me is at the restaurant in Norway. I was a sous chef. I was working with this apprentice, and I had spent the better part of like late summer taking a bunch of these carrots and pickling them for the larder that we had created that was going to last us throughout the winter. And they were quite expensive because this farmer happened to get them and grow them at a very specific size for us. And I put these kind of expensive aromatics in the jar as I pickled them. And I was having this apprentice right before the end of the day, right before service for him, because he came in the morning and he prepped all day and then he kind of went home right before service happened. And I basically said, hey, could you please take these carrots and cut them in half? And after they're cut in half, you can basically go home. He said, yes, chef. He like went off and grabbed his cutting boards, did all the things. I wasn't watching him because it was right before service. I was getting ready. I was on the Expediting station. I was basically getting ready to check all the other things that needed to be in place before service happened. And it was something like very shortly after, right? So it was maybe like this project should have taken him probably like 25 minutes, 30 minutes, maybe 40 minutes if he was really being particular on this thing. And it was something like 6 minutes later or 8 minutes later, he comes to me and he says, okay, chef, I'm all done. I'm going to, get going. And I kind of paused for a second. I was like, you got all those carrots? You cut all those carrots in half just now? And he was like, yeah, chef, I cut them in half, just like you said. And I said, can you bring me some carrots of what you cut in half so I can take a look at those? And sure enough, he did not split them this way like I had intended for him to. He lined them all up on his cutting board and just cut them in this direction. And I could just like transport myself back into that kitchen, staring at him, holding these carrots in his hand like he had just like killed a baby bird. And he was like, no. So yeah, if you have an embarrassing story of a way that you messed up something relatively mundane or simple and it ended up teaching you a valuable lesson, I'd love to know it in the comments because I think that those stories of learnings can be quite comedic.
Hold on 4, hold on 5, and let's fire 6, chef. Please, chef. Fire agnolotti. Let's fire agnolotti. Fire wagyu. Fire wagyu. Wagyu. I need my ravioli. I need my rib cap, guys. Where is my rib cap, guys? Please.
I've done the rant in previous episodes about desire and passion before when it comes to showing up excited to work on the day-to-day, even though the stuff that you're doing might be relatively the same or it might start to feel mundane. I do think that it is a little bit interesting that a lot of chefs talk about the fact that they chose kitchens because they didn't want a 9-to-5 or a boring desk job. But in a lot of ways, when you're charged with doing a consistent execution of things and you show up and you're in the same kitchen in the same 4 walls with the same equipment and the same ingredients, it's like there's little that can sometimes change. And so I'm not saying that kitchens are these constantly changing dynamic things. When you switch up the menu on a regular basis, that can cause a little bit of that kind of like reinvigoration into the work and get excited about things. How much does that contribute towards bouncing around in kitchens? Like, you're learning effectively plateaus. I guess maybe what I'm trying to say is like what the staff wants sometimes, which is like novelty and learning new things and experimentation and let's try something new outside of our comfort zone. And what the guest needs, quote unquote, which is consistency, the ability to rely on the quality of the execution. I need to be able to have like expectations as I go into this meal. I want the same thing that my friend had when they told me that I should book a table here. They can sometimes be at odds, and you can fall into this trap of this. People think of restaurants as these just kind of like push, high octane, environments, which in a lot of ways is true. But maybe that's the other way to kind of like phrase it, is that if you can just get good at the consistent basics of showing up, and that's why I talk about habits so much, is because that can make this feel a little bit less strenuous on you. You can decrease your level of stress throughout your week, and you can ultimately make it something where it's like not that hard to manage. This is restaurant dependent, like caveat, but I think that that's what we're also seeing play out here.
Or we could do this. We could put the name of the fucking restaurant outside on the fucking restaurant.
Yeah.
Someone who's like a restaurant architect or a historian on some of this stuff needs to give me a little bit of a lesson on why that ended up being the case, at least in the kind of like from 2005 to 2015, why that ended up being a thing of like, I know Alinea did it where there was just like this black exterior, very, unadorned. I think Momofuku had it for a little while where they didn't put the name of the restaurant outside. There's a couple other places in New York that come to mind, places in Copenhagen that did it. And it's so funny to me that that's in a world of, you kind of like want to be too cool for school, maybe. Oh, we're getting access to this thing that is like not available to other people, even though like if you do the search on Google Maps, it's like it shows you exactly where the restaurant is. It's just funny that some of the optimizations and improvements that Uncle is talking about might actually have adverse effects on the restaurant and the public perception of it. It's almost like fashion, right? Where he's talking about like, let's do a big 12 top in the middle of the room. Let's put the name of the restaurant outside. And if that changes the vibe of the dining room or takes away a little bit of that like allure of the space, it actually could cause these downstream effects where the people you actually want to come eat at your restaurant don't end up showing up because the vibes are off now all of a sudden. And I just think that that's an interesting thing of like being careful as you're going into your creative endeavor, especially as it starts to become more of a business, to kind of like almost like Rick Rubin, the project a little bit, and kind of like trust your own taste. There's just an interesting analogy. I think it's in marketing from a guy named George Mack, where he talks about if you do enough split testing, what you end up with is porn. And I think with restaurants, it could kind of be the same thing, where if you split test enough, or if you optimize with all the best practices and whatever, you just end up with a McDonald's. I think I talked about that in a previous episode about like, you just end up serving burgers. And then it's kind of like, well, what's the point? And yes, I will geek out about operations until the cows come home, but there is an element as I'm getting older to realizing the fact that taste and just kind of like being unabashedly confident in what you want to be can be more powerful than any of those other factors that might weigh on your decisions.
1 minute, hold on. John H! John H!
We talked about it previously. In order for this like department, the sandwich department of the restaurant, to be profitable, running it with just Ibram needs to be the way to do it. Otherwise, if you add another staff member, if you decrease the hours, if you limit the number of people who can come get sandwiches, it destroys the whole benefit of having an alternative revenue source in the first place. And so that's a little bit of a paradox that we're seeing here, where he's by himself. He doesn't, because he didn't, kind of like decided to not complete his culinary school education, doesn't have TSD going on, and that ultimately harms him when he's trying to juggle however many tickets that he's doing. And I think anybody who's like run a lunch service by themselves, or had to open without any support, or been by themselves running a station at an event or something like that, it turns into this problem where you wish you just had a little bit more blank, but you're not getting it because financially it just maybe wouldn't make the most sense.
We have 60 seats, 5 nights a week, 52 weeks a year. At 2.5 turns, each seat is worth $113,750.
$50.
Probably one of the more interesting things that comes from being involved in finance conversations, when you finally get to the place in your career where you have the ability to have that seat at the table and just get some insights into how are the numbers looking. I just wanted to positively call out the combination of forward-looking, I hope that this happens, this is what we're going to experiment with, we're going to try this, and then rear rear facing, this is how we did, these are the goods and the bads, really kind of like not overinflating, like just accuracy at what happened in the past. And I think that business owners, I fell into this at certain stages of businesses that I've been a part of in the past too, is like, you spend so much time looking forward and you say, I don't want to look at the past. I don't want to look at what my numbers were. I don't want to know. But what if we did this? What if we managed to get these number of clients or customers? What if we decided to charge more? And then the other camp is the people who never do any of that kind of like forward looking, let's try to adjust things and change things. They just only spend time on mulling over, just kind of like, can I find a couple percentage points here? Can I ultimately maybe identify a place where, oh, we, had a little bit too much waste here, or, oh, I overstaffed at this point. And what that results in, or what I see in the folks that I work with, is the people who are too rear facing, they just end up beating themselves up about it. And they start to feel super, super negative about like, I can't do any changes. Look at how many bad decisions I made. Look at what could have been. And then I have some people who are kind of like, they're so in the future and conceptual and like up in the clouds. And yeah, before they opened, that's all they had was hypotheticals. We did hypotheticals before they opened, of basically kind of like taking a look at the floor plan, calculating, well, maybe what if the price was this? And now that they actually have a little bit of data where they can take a look at how we did after X number of weeks of being open, you can make more sound decisions. And again, the value, and the people who I see in business who are doing really, really well for themselves find that right combination of doing both and being like almost unemotional about it. We're getting into like super basic lesson territory here, but I have to remind myself that like there's new folks that are entering the industry that watch the channel. And also when I see it happening in places, I have to remind myself that this is like something worth sharing. And it's almost like this 3-step framework for how to break down a kitchen. And the way that I like to think about it is food goes away first, equipment goes away second, and then you clean from top to bottom. Why in this order? Well, for one, the food is the thing that you want to ideally save for the next day, if it is even something possible to save for the next day. It also helps to remove a substantial amount of clutter from whatever it is that you're doing. And so that's typically step one that I like to advise people to do. Second one is equipment. So any of your deli containers or your cutting boards or any of the kind of like hardware that you used to set up your station is really helpful to kind of like get up and out of the way. The reason you do that is because if you start scrubbing and you have cutting boards still out, then all of a sudden you're either cleaning around them, which is kind of by definition not as clean as you could be getting if you just needed to take that to dish anyways, but you can batch some of this stuff together, right? Because all the food is put away. Now all you have is kind of like empty or kind of like unused equipment that you can batch together. You can kind of like stack things and take them to the dish area and drop them off. You can put equipment back to maybe you need to run downstairs and do some stuff. You can batch some of those together so you're not making too many unnecessary trips. And you just kind of like, again, order of operations, you're doing these in order. And then the third thing is you clean from top to bottom. And so you ultimately might start with cleaning this shelf, right? And then you can go down, and then you can go down, right? Like you can see them starting with this countertop, and then after that countertop's clean, then they clean the sides of whatever countertop this is, or the low boys, and then they're going to do the floors after. And that's really beneficial, because what happens if you do the floors first, and then now you start scrubbing the countertops, you have soap suds that are going down on the floor, and now you have to do it again. So it helps prevent wasted work. I know it seems super basic, but it's like a framework of cleaning that I use wherever I happen to be. See, she's just squeegeeing right down onto the floor because they know that he's going to start scrubbing the floors. You also see this 3-person setup where one person's scrubbing, one person's squeegeeing, one person's using a towel. That helps get the entire project done faster. And that's sometimes how you end up breaking down, is that you try to get everybody on that same page. So, if your food isn't put away, maybe your station partner comes over and helps you.
All right, so starting tonight, guys, we're gonna add a seating for half of the room at 9:30. No, hey, come on. I know.
You can call it an unpopular opinion. We can call this a harsh truth of the business, but I think it is one of these disheartening moments when a decision gets made. It's typically financially related, whether it's hours get cut, equipment gets cut, resources get cut in some way, shape, or form, or workload gets increased, whether it's through another service, another seating that's happening here. I talked about adding like lunch in the past, or a different revenue stream. We need to do more courses. And I think the reason that these decisions are met with like this face or this face, these are memeable faces that we're showing here, is because you, as the person who's executing on whatever that new change needs to be, basically don't get any upside from that happening. It's all, and like the reason that the decision is being made again, putting my business owner hat on here, is because we're in a hole. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's not because we want to squeeze a little bit more out or, whatever. Sometimes that can happen that way. Don't get me wrong. But I think this is what we're seeing play out here is like, we're in the red. You know what I mean? We are not going to survive this year unless we do this thing, which is over and above where we currently are now. And again, these people might be in some sort of comfort zone right now, right? Like the relative novelty of menu changing every day, where things are, how to seat people, the common questions guests ask, your kind of like flow through the steps of service. It's like all of that stuff is kind of subsided. And now it's this over and above, we need you to do more kind of push that, again, Richie even calls it, it's going to be a push. And because I've been on both sides, I've been the one breaking this bad news as the leader, and then I've also been the person who's the employee who's getting told some of these changes are happening and how it's going to affect me. I can kind of empathetically speak from both sides. Going from the employee perspective, just for a hot second here, it's like, if I got told that we needed to, do another seating like we're doing it here, but I'm actually going to see a 20% increase in my paycheck, it's like, oh, sweet. You know what I mean? Like, okay, that's fine. I think the reason it's met with some of this is because it's like, again, there's no upside here. If we can manage to hit this revenue goal, everybody's going to get an extra 2 days off per month or something like that. Like, oh my goodness, that insert any other thing that I care about. Even take the monetary stuff out of it. Like, I would get excited at certain seasons of my career of, we're going to spend a couple of extra hours per week, but we're really going to try to go for the Michelin star. And so instead of, kind of like cutting service short on Tuesdays is going to be like an R&D day. I would get stoked about that kind of stuff because it's like, I get to test things. I get to be the one to present new dish ideas. We're really going to try for this thing. We're going to up our quality of service. We're going to start using more high quality ingredients. And again, I'm sure there's stories of people who are getting taken advantage of in their workplace. I hate those stories. But I do think that it's sometimes a situation like this where the ask is being made not out of greed. It is genuinely out of business necessity. We will not be open if we do not make these changes. And I think in certain stages of my career, I'd look at something like this and I'd say, yeah, you're just looking at the easiest lever to pull, which is like asking employees to work more. Because another lever to pull that would get the same result is to charge more, right? Like increase the prices. And that could also drive a similar outcome, right? Like get us closer to the goal where we want to be at. But that's a little bit more uncomfortable for the business owner. They don't want to do that. They're afraid. And so like that can ultimately cause, again, more of this tension. But as I got more experienced, I started to learn that like that's not also a clean trade-off, because if you're asking your core team to work more, what's going to happen? You're going to drive them into working overtime. And so that is like not actually saving you that much on cost. There has to have been a projection that was run where doing a 9:30 seating, even if it's just half of a turn, and if the demand is there, then that ultimately might make it so that certain people can get cut, or you know what I mean? Like maybe there's part-time people that need to get hired. Like there's all sorts of nuance to these conversations, but the first time the information gets dropped, it can absolutely be one of these eye roll moments.
So this is something, actually, I don't think we've ever done this, but I was looking at this beautiful, curious looking table. I was like, these guys, we gotta pull back the curtain for these guys.
That absolutely happens. I talked about it earlier on in this episode with the kitchen tour kind of stall thing that you will do sometimes. That I actually had this happen the first time I ever ate at Cezanne in San Francisco, back when they didn't even have 3 stars yet. There were 2 Michelin star restaurants. I went to go eat with my roommate. It was his birthday, and the exact same thing happened to us. We were eating. We had a long meal. We had a lot of wine, and they needed the table back. And so what they invited us to do is to basically say, hey, can we offer you guys a cocktail on us as a celebratory thing for, the gentleman here's birthday, and we would like to have you join us in the bar area where our bartender, our mixologist will make you, XYZ thing. And it's the framing of, this is an act of generosity. This is something we're going above and beyond to do for you because, again, unreasonable hospitality. And it's such a win-win scenario, right? Because the restaurant gets what it wants, whether it's, decreasing staffing. You can let a couple people go now because we're not having so many tables in the restaurant, and there's more people in the bar. And so now we can actually start to clean up this area, or now that table's free and we can clear it. We can make it available for the next party that's coming in, or, we can decrease the burden on the kitchen. There's so many, again, like levers that you can pull in these complex, ecosystems that are restaurants. And so, yeah, that absolutely happens.
So in our kitchen, we like to foster an environment of what we call vibrant collaboration. So think about that as we come into the kitchen.
I'm having to refire. I'm having to refire 15 times, chef. 15 what?
It's the kitchen. As you can see, a lot of energy,
Thank you, chefs.
Guess I hadn't quite brought it up in other videos of why quiet kitchens are a thing, because in certain environments where kitchen tours are the norm, it is very commonplace to have guests walking into the environment. You don't want to have any of those screaming matches or fights between stations ultimately happening. And so it's just like this baseline expectation that we are going to be guest ready at all points in time, whether that's cleanliness or, again, the level of noise, or to Richie's point, the level of energy that's happening. We want it to be guest friendly at all times. I think there's one way to kind of phrase that. I've also made requests in the past to, like, hey, if it wouldn't be too much to ask, like, I would really like to see the kitchen. And the front of house person I'm making that request to basically says something to the effect of, like, I need to actually go speak with the kitchen to give them a heads up to make sure that everything's ready. And depending on when the meal was, sometimes it's because it's the end of the night and they're scrubbing down and they're just kind of like, we don't necessarily want you to stand there and watch us scrubbing down. And so, again, the timing of this kind of matters too. It can also cause a full wrench into things depending on how the seating is actually progressing, because if, you know, these seem to be like random people, but if these were like Carmen's friends or Sydney's friends, and all of a sudden they're going to want to talk to Sydney for 15 minutes, all of a sudden now you have to kind of like understand that a fifth of the brigade is now missing, and now we have to shuffle around. I think the folks that I see do an amazing job of this have, again, either some sort of baseline expectation, or there is like a very clean step of service where, you know, Richie wants to do a kitchen tour. He will, in advance, maybe 15 minutes in advance, he'll highlight it on the ticket, let the expediter know that this table is going to be having a kitchen tour in 15 minutes. And then that expediter takes the responsibility of letting the entire kitchen brigade know. Housekeeping, do you know what I mean? Like, that is the thing that we've covered from previous episodes. Make sure your station looks really tight. We're going to have guests in the kitchen.
Lamb with yogurt, duck with apricot.
Duck with cherry, rib cap with bordelaise, lamb au jus, duck with orange.
It is the flex to say that your menu changes every day, and I'm not going to discount the immense amount of work that goes into, you know, doing that as a daily practice and making sure that you're on top of ordering and prep and making sure that the wine pairings are right and explaining all of the sets to the front of house team. But I think it is this funny thing when you really settle into the groove there, you really start to acknowledge, like, the proteins we like using, or the produce that we like using in this season, or the preparations that we do when this comes in, is just, it starts to turn into that concept of mad libbing the menu, where, you know, the protein is going to be rib cap, or the lamb, what are we going to do with the lamb? It's like one of the 5 sets we do with lamb. And yes, on paper, it's changing every day, but it's really just rotating through these main similar, you know, kind of like heavy hitters. I mean, like duck with orange, you know what I mean? Like, this is not an inventive combination.
Not the same bowl.
It's fine.
It's not fine, Richie.
Correct me in the comments if my take is off here. I think what we're trying to portray here is Carmen has so many of the other problems from the menu and the flow and the ordering and the staffing on lock. And so now he's diverting this kind of like OCD attention to these things that just like don't need to be optimized. Like on day one, he was not thinking about these bowls. You know, obviously he made the order. He decided to work with his ceramicist. He was the one who probably should have seen this stuff, and it's not that big of a deal. And it is actually something that is causing him some anxiety, and he's, you know, getting all up in a tizzy around the sides of these bowls. Because, correct me if I'm wrong, the idea of the wabi-sabi, there's a little bit of imperfection in these because they were made by hand from a ceramicist that we decided to source from, is part of the charm, is part of the reason why you use this stuff. It's part of the reason why you don't order from a big box store when you're sourcing for a restaurant like this, because that quality is what makes it special. And even looking at these bowls side by side, like, I know you can't see it in the way that this shot is framed right now and the way that Hulu crops it out. I hate that Hulu crops it out, because looking at these bowls, it's so obvious that they're from the same ceramicist. They are from the same line. They were all made probably at the same time for this batch order for this restaurant. And we've seen restaurants lean into the mismatched nature of the serviceware thing. I posted that whole video on this place called Atomix that I went to, my wife and I. When you sit down, they give you a choice of chopsticks, and they're all different. And the way that they, again, make that special, because not all their chopsticks are the same, is they turn it into like a game. It's a step of the way that they present something to you, and they say, we want you to pick which one is yours, and then you ultimately get to keep that pair of chopsticks for the rest of the meal. I think the place that we see this happening productively is if maybe the bowls aren't stacking right and they're falling over when the dishwasher is putting them up back away at whatever storage location these happened to be in. Or maybe there's a world where whatever we put in these, if we're steaming a custard inside of these bowls, the fact that they're either a different shape or a different volume, or the way that they are just like laid out is just a little bit off. The way that they go go underneath the broiler, the way that they bake. Like sometimes if we put this custard in the steam oven for 11 minutes, now all of a sudden, you know, like it's wrong because the bowls are different sizes. That can, or the way that the surface area of it is once it comes out and it's steamed, we can't plate everything consistently. And so the way that this dish looks, because these bowls are different sizes, that's causing us problems. That I can see. But the bowls being slightly off and Carmen being, again, a little bit maniacal here, I just, you know, maybe not.
Fire ravioli. Fire duck.
It's the great paradox. By dialing things down and doing duck with orange or cherry jus and stuff that people have seen before, it makes it so that you're a little bit more approachable. You might get more people to come in. And it also makes it a little bit more consistent because you have dialed in your orange sauce and you have everything exactly how you want it. And that allows you to achieve a certain level of consistency. But now, without that innovation, you make it a little bit less likely that people will kind of like talk about you as a standout. You're not taking as many risks. But it might make you a little bit more profitable because you're getting things that are a little bit more easy to get a hold of. You can maybe achieve some more economies of scale with your ordering because you're not doing as much kind of like switching between ingredients. You have the ability to, you know, like not work so seasonally maybe, and the menu changes a little bit less. It's such a dance.
May I ask you a question?
Yeah.
What the fuck is this? What happened?
I grabbed a really hot pot.
Have you subscribed? Have you liked the video?
Was covered in stitches and skin glue and...
I'm not saying this is Claire trying to like one up Carmen's injury, but there certainly is that behavior between chefs where, you know, you'll see somebody scar and then somebody will come in and be like, oh, look at this one I have. And let me tell you the story that happened. What I take away from this scene is all the stories I could tell from my experience, I'm sure you have some as well, is the fact that we call these intense stories. And it's really just food. It's working in a restaurant. It's cooking. And you have other industries like medicine that are literally life or death. I think that perspective can be helpful as you're thinking about, you know, what's happening to you on the day-to-day or the things that have happened in your past and potentially how that impacts your future. It is that the worst thing that's ever happened to you is the worst thing that's ever happened to you anecdote. Carmen also said the worst time in a restaurant is Saturday at 8:15 p.m. And that's because that is the busiest night of most fine dining kitchens whole week. And that's because in the fine dining context, these are experiences. They take multiple hours. You're typically drinking alcohol. You're ingesting a lot of food. Doing that on a weeknight is just not something that most people end up doing. When you have your day off, the Monday through Friday people who are making the amount of money who can typically come out to experiences like this, Saturday is the day when they can do it. Or if they're on vacation and all the other activities are happening during the week because maybe it's a conference and you happen to be in New York for that. And because of that increase in demand, you'll often see what happened last episode where Richie was talking about, okay, let's add another turn, let's add more tables here. And that is often pushed on the restaurant team on Saturdays because, again, you have the demand, so why not take advantage of it and just be more busy? And as if the increase in numbers on a Saturday wasn't enough, typically you'll also have VIPs that come in on Saturdays. And so the pressure is increased even more because there's another chef that's eating or a food critic or a celebrity that's come in and you need to do a couple of extra steps of service there. And it's just that increased level of pressure where the chef maybe added a couple of extra dishes to the menu or the celebrity has security detail coming with them. Also, for a lot of restaurants at that level, Saturday is your Friday. And so it's the last day of your week because Sunday, Monday, the restaurant's closed. And so you're kind of bringing in all of the tiredness of 4 days of working into Saturday. Pardon the pun, but it kind of is just a recipe for an intense day. I've also totally experienced a kitchen injury where it hurts so bad that it doesn't hurt, both on the burn side as well as the cutting yourself on the knife side. I talked about that story in a previous video, but it is one of those things where it happens and then maybe hours later, minutes later, even days later, all of a sudden it's like this really intense pain, maybe when it's healing or when the nerves finally end up starting to get their feeling back, which is definitely one thing that can contribute to a burn being that bad, especially on a high sensitive area like your hand. But another one that I didn't see anybody really talk about with this scene is maybe that was a pan that had something like a truffle sauce that is both really expensive and me as the person who made that put tons and tons of time into making it. And so when you go to grab it, it's almost like, it's hard to explain. It's like this mental recircuitry that happens where, yes, it's really hurt. It's painful, but maybe it's something like a tray of something that is like, it took you ages and you know you're really going to be in trouble if you end up dropping this thing. And so you will just physically brute force your way through the pain to make sure that you don't drop that thing and lose your mise en place. Carmen didn't add any context on what was in that pot that he grabbed that was so hot, but it is just something that I've experienced where you're just like, like, oh my goodness, I just need to get this to the counter so I don't lose it. I also didn't really hear when chronologically in Carmen's journey this burn happened. I know for me, in my experience, I was told in one of the earliest kitchens that I worked in to just assume everything metal is hot, and then that made it so that I had like a dry side towel, basically, that I would use, and just you fold it up and you create a couple of different layers, and then that turns into something that you can grab trays and pan handles with. Certain kitchens have oven mitts that they use on hooks, or they slap it on a magnet on the side of the oven. The problem with oven mitts is they can get kind of grimy either on the inside or on the outside, and they're typically a little bit harder to wash and get totally clean. A towel is something that you're just going to get at the start of your day, and then you can just use that as kind of like a hot pad, whether that's like a trivet on the countertop so that you're not setting hot trays on countertops that could potentially warp. Or if you know that you're making a lot of tray projects, let's say for the day, you're making a lot of chips, you can just make sure that you start your day with extra towels, dry towels, so that you can make sure that you're not burning yourself throughout the day.
Hey, morning, Tina. Good to see you.
That's it?
That's it.
It's kind of dead.
Yeah, there's fewer and fewer months to grow vegetables now, and because of that, there's fewer and fewer farms. Used to be you could come down here, buy everything you needed for a full menu, all in one spot. Whatever grows together, goes together.
Spoiler alert, I'm not a farmer, and so if we want to expand in the comments on anything that the character in the show had to say about the state of growing things, please sound off in the comments. From a chef's perspective, what I have seen, and what is maybe a response or a rebuttal to this fact that the scope of what farmers are growing is not so wide, is chefs or individual restaurants working with farmers to say, okay, there's one specific plot, you're going to grow this specific piece of produce for us, and then we're going to basically just buy all of it from you. And that gives you the ability to have like range outside of what, either is typically grown or what everybody else, maybe even the restaurant across the street, happens to have on their menu. You have this special thing that nobody else has. And then because you have that increased range from the farms that you're working with, that also allows you to do that principle that we talked about in the last episode of not repeating ingredients. And then you can keep up that length of tasting menu throughout the entire year instead of having periods like this in the fall and the winter time where growing is sparse. They also exchange this common phrase, what grows together goes together. And the first time I heard about that was in my wine class in culinary school. You can certainly find elements of that rooted in kind of winemaking and viticulture. You'll also see it on the culinary side, especially when we're talking about two elements, time and place. And so time, I think, is the one that people know most distinctly when we're talking about seasons, or even as people have explored into like micro seasons and the times between spring, summer, fall, winter. I did a whole pop-up series ages ago where I basically did that. I would go to the farmer's market, I do a walk through, I do a lap, write notes on my phone, and then I would sit down after I had all those ingredients, and I would basically just be able to write a quick tasting menu based off of what was available. So sometimes that seasonality can drive the flavor combinations together. I know for me, the first time I had tomato and melon together, it wasn't something that I would intuitively put together, but they grow at the same time. And so lo and behold, when you end up putting them on a plate together, obviously you have to do the required seasonings and techniques and proportions together. They actually do end up working together. So the time one's a little easier to understand because it is more along the lines of the growing season and it has the plant's life cycle and when you harvest. But then there's other ones that are more place oriented, where this thing happens to be available the whole year round. And so this might be something geography based where it's on the coast or it's on a flat plain and you have a lot of farmland, or you're high up in the mountains. And so I was taught this idea of like the word grows can kind of balloon out. There's a concentric circle around that of other things like pigs being available, or fish and shellfish, or let's take an example of like lamb being available in the springtime. It goes with peas and asparagus. Oh, interesting. Grows together, goes together.
What? Bear. What?
Okay, let me.
No, every major food
Let
critic.
me. Every major food critic.
I've talked about the cookbook shelf before, but somebody has quite the Barefoot Contessa cookbook collection going on. All right, let's talk about face sheets when it comes to food critics. There's a couple of reasons here. The first one being the fact that you just want that proximity bias and that exposure to seeing these faces over and over and over again. If it's buried inside of a binder, or if somebody sends an email and it's just in a zip file, if you see this face walking in and you haven't seen this person's face for 9 months, then oh my goodness, you're not going to have that immediate recollection. And so having it front and center is helpful for the people that are working in that restaurant, regardless of the level of experience that they have, to just continually be used to seeing these faces and to have that, again, mental thing in the back of your brain. The logical follow-on question from that is, Justin, wouldn't we know that this person is coming into the restaurant? And the answer is not always. This kind of comes in and out of fashion, but some critics go under either pseudonyms, they work for a company, and so they're not always the one that's kind of like front and center when it comes to like them being on camera in this new Instagram age of talking about food. So you might know somebody's name, you might have heard of them or read their writing in the past, but you might not actually know what they look like. And the pseudonym part is done because because the critic typically wants to have as close to a normal experience as possible. If the chef knows that the critic happens to be coming, they're going to prep extra courses. They're going to make sure they have a specific table in the restaurant. Maybe they're going to like do something extra for that person when they come in and have the experience. We've seen instances in the kind of food reviewer restaurant critic timeline where it was actually something that the critic would pay attention to. So what am I getting in relation to what every other table in the restaurant is getting? And if that is a massive difference, that's actually going to be something that I write about in my review. And so these two forces are kind of at odds. The chef wants everything to be like as good as it can possibly be, a level up from what the normal experience happens to be. And the critic actually wants that to be a more accurate thing, as long as that critic is the type of person who is like, I want this to be, I do my work because I want it to be an accurate representation for the people that I'm writing for, and so that everybody can make a good decision on where they're going out to eat. Trying to not paint with too broad of a brush here, different critics have a different like why as to why they do what they do. And so just understanding that's how the game is played, these face sheets at restaurants can typically try to be the best solve for this situation that you can kind of muster. And so ideal situation is this person ends up walking in, you recognize their face, and because everybody has been consistently seeing this person, the person maybe at the host stand can relay that information to somebody else in front of house who can bring it back to the kitchen, and then the head chef knows, oh my goodness, there's a critic here tonight. And that swings the timing more in the restaurant's favor, where they have that little extra time to make sure that if they need to shuffle things around, or if they need to add a new dish, or they need to prep something extra, they can do so. All of this is done to prevent one of the worst case scenarios, we move to the other end of the spectrum, where that person gets to the end of the meal, or maybe they're halfway through the meal, and now all of a sudden somebody recognizes, or somebody had the epiphany, or somebody got the text message from another restaurant across town that like, hey, so-and-so critic is happening to eat around, and I heard that they're coming to your restaurant maybe sometime this week. It's a level of proactivity done by the restaurant because you want the critic's experience to be as good as it can possibly be, so then they write favorably about you, because the results of that review or that piece of content that they publish, whether we like it or not, has long-term business implications. And so again, you just need to be aware of this stuff and dance around it in the best way you can.
I'm Adam Shapiro. I'm the
Oh, from Ever.
Yeah.
Yeah, hey.
Oh, so good to bump into you.
Yeah, nice to
Yeah.
meet you.
Oh, it's so funny. God, probably shouldn't tell you this. I know it's early, but I snuck into the Bear
Oh, when?
2 weeks ago.
How'd you get past Carmen and Richie?
They seem pretty busy yelling at each other.
This is why you got to have face sheets, because when you're busy, when things are chaotic, they can fly under the radar. You're not paying the most attention to individual nuances like people's faces. And again, whether we like it or not, I would love to have a conversation in the comments with some of you folks that experiences kind of like fall to this level that is reasonable to sustain. That is the thing that 80% of guests, 90%, 99% of guests are going to get on a weekly, daily basis. But then you have this additional level, this gear you can shift into that is over and above. That is the VIP execution of something. You can't do that for everybody. It's unreasonable to expect that, but it is something where the person who is the chef who just kind of wants to check out the restaurant and see what it's all about, you want that run-of-the-mill, normal, quote-unquote, experience. And the critic wants that too, because if you get 5 extra VIP courses or canapes, or you get the kitchen tour, you get all the extra zhuzhing, that's just not something that every single person who comes in and sits down at that restaurant can expect. And so the chef who's coming from across the street who wants to see, what are these guys really about? And so I talk about these two things being at odds because the chef wants to show this is the exemplification of the peak of my abilities. This is exactly what I can do when you really max me out. And then everybody else, the chef who's across the street who wants to see what is this restaurant all about on a Tuesday night, or the critic who's coming and saying, I'm writing for, the couple who has been saving up for months to come to this experience. I'm writing to make sure that my experience is a reflection of what they're going to get. It's just so funny because you end up with this bifurcation of, you hear somebody had the quote unquote normal experience. We didn't get a chance to go in above and beyond for you. And you almost have this like, oh, I'm sorry. That feels like it sucks. We could have done more. And so if we understand this to be true, instead of trying to fight it, instead of trying to swim against the current, with the chefs that I work with, what I really try to emphasize is like trying to make that baseline sustainable execution actually as good as it can possibly be, something you're proud of when the person says, runs into you on the subway, bumps into you at the bar, and they say, hey, I came in the other night. You get excited. You say like, oh my goodness, how was it? Did you enjoy your time? And then the flexing moments, the over and above things can also be something you get excited about, but it doesn't turn into this thing where you're almost like apologizing for what the mundane day-to-day normal looks like.
How's your dad feeling about the place?
I realize there's a little bit of comedic relief in this scene of Carmen cutting himself, Sydney taking over, and then her cutting herself on these grapefruit supremes. But if I may offer up a solution to potentially prevent that from happening, it's one of these prep projects that goes against what you're taught in knife skills, to not cut towards your hand. And so speaking as someone who has had a lot of supremes on their prep list at one point in time, you get them to this point where all of the rind has been removed, and then you can have it actually down on the cutting board, and you kind of like do the cuts on the cutting board, you're using your other hand to almost roll the citrus all the way around and kind of hold it up and support it, because once you have enough segments out of that citrus, it kind of starts to get floppy. And so then you get to this place where you are ultimately using the cutting board and cutting down towards something that is not going to injure your fingers. I also support this setup. Doing it on a tray is something you can totally do, because it is something where juice is going to go everywhere. And so at different points throughout the prep project, you maybe pick the tray up, and if you have another container that you're storing the Supremes in, if you're keeping it in the juice, you pour that juice over the top, or maybe you keep the juice separate because you're going to incorporate it into something like a vinaigrette. I talk about station strategy, stuff like this, and more inside Total Station Domination, link in the description.
Bullshit. Run the fucking lid.
Oh, it's good. I'll do it.
Great way to start off episode 5 with a classic scene of standing inside of the recycling dumpster. This can sometimes happen in the trash dumpster, where you just don't have enough space and you have to climb in and stomp down trash bags. It's something I'm all too familiar with. I've done it before. This is obviously referencing the non-negotiables list of breaking down boxes, because it is absolutely a total ball ache when you have to go outside and do this. And this is often something that falls on the shoulders of somebody who is in a leadership position, because they are the ones who are going to get that phone call from the trash company or the neighbors across the street or the landlord who is saying, hey, you have boxes strewn all over the place. Can you chalk it up to laziness? Absolutely. There are people, you tell them multiple times these boxes need to get broken down. You put it on a list like Carmen's non-negotiables, and it still ends up happening. So why? I'm curious. The first one that comes to mind for me is just time. You will sometimes see boxes pile up in other areas of the restaurant, not just in the recycling bin. So this might be by the back door as you're going out into the alley, because you happen to get a bunch of stuff from the walk-in, or you had a cardboard box in your station, and now that everything has been processed, you have this box that needs to go somewhere, and you might actually ask somebody as they're coming by, hey, can you take this out to the recycling? Now that job and that time has been offloaded onto somebody else, and that is something that, as you're thinking about, I need to get set up by a certain time, it is a constant trade-off that you're thinking about. Do I go back to my station and finish picking the basil, or do I spend the 45 seconds breaking down this box? As you're getting closer and closer and closer to service happening, and more of your task list is starting to pile up on top of itself, you end up making that call, that sacrifice, and you say, I'm not going to break down the box. I'm going to go back on my station and make sure that I finish the chicken skin chips. Not saying it's right to do that. I'm just trying to provide a little bit of context for why this stuff happens, because when somebody looks at this and they say it's pretty straightforward, this person's not following instructions, there's other factors at play here. It's also a culture of the company / like environmental mimetic thing. So you go out to the recycling bin, the stuff has just been picked up, and it's a completely empty recycle bin, and somebody takes their box and they throw it in there because, hey, I have tons of space, there's not a bunch of other stuff in there, I'm just gonna, I'll just put my box in there. And then the next person comes along, and the next person comes along, and before you know it, there's only like maybe 9 boxes in there, but the dumpster's all the way full. And that has parallels across a bunch of other things in professional kitchens too. And it eventually gets in this place where somebody who has the standards to say, hey guys, we can fit 3 times as much stuff in this bin if we manage to just break every single thing down. So those are more behavioral reasons. This is actually a tool. I keep this actually in the side of my desk here. This is just a cheap X-Acto knife. You can get these. I'll link one in the description if anybody's interested. You probably have one if you work in professional kitchens, or a different kind of small like pocket knife. I happen to like these a lot because they're relatively straightforward to snap off the pieces and make sure that you're always having one where the tip is really sharp, and then it also has a clip on the back, so you can put it in your pocket in a way where it's not going to get buried in whatever pants you happen to be wearing. And having one of these, I'll speak personally for myself, I find removes that excuse of, oh, it's too hard to break down this box, because not every single box, this is an incredibly industry accurate scene in the sense that not every single box that you find in a professional kitchen environment is that very easy to rip Amazon tape. Might be multiple tapes on different sides of the box, and it might be layered in a way where it's not just rip and tear and then all of a sudden break it down. It might take some extra time. There's other boxes here where the corners are secured with adhesive, or it's multiple layers of cardboard stacked on top of each other. And if you have something that is ready to just slice through cardboard and make it really easy to break things down, you're more likely to actually do it and adhere to that standard. And I like these because they have the sturdiness to stand up to things like cardboard, but then you can also use them inside of the kitchen, or maybe even out in the trash area for things like plastic. And you can also cut tape with this in a way where you always have a blade on you, where even at the end of the day, when you've put all your tray away, as we talked about in previous episodes, that might have your scissors on it, you always have a blade on you so you can cut your tape at all times.
To the place my heart is yearning.
Simple plating detail move. You saw Carmen take, I think this is a turnip, and dab it on a seafold towel. And that's often because you'll see things like microgreens or tiny petite vegetables being held in either just water or ice water, because we use the term shock in the industry because that will sometimes make sure that the leaves of the vegetable stay pretty like tight and taut and hydrated. Counter that with what you'll see sometimes when things are wilted, especially if they're in a cold air circulating environment like a fridge, and that's actually just like drying them out and starving them of moisture. It's a situation where you're not wanting to have the water from that storage environment make its way onto the plate, and that's going to make the plate look a little bit more messy. We don't explicitly hear why Carmen is not a fan of this dish, why he takes it and throws it into the trash. If I had to guess, he's trying to take this simplicity idea maybe a little bit too far. I don't think this dish would eat very well. It's this idea that we've kind of talked about in other episodes where you have protein, sauce, garnish, and you can distill it down to just 3 components. That's really, really exciting. Let's take the garnish. It is an unseasoned raw turnip. How is that going to eat? You're going to have to cut off the greens. You're going to have these tender greens, and then the stemmy piece you're going to have to either combine with other bites, or you're just going to have to eat them on their own. Because the vegetable itself is raw and it's a root vegetable, so to speak, if that person who's ending up deciding they don't want to put the whole turnip into their mouth, they want to cut it, because it's raw, you risk that person trying to go cut into it and it shoots across the dining room. Moving on to the protein, it looks like they're trying to do a little bit of a flex on the cook on this. There isn't like a huge gray ring on the outside of it, but it also looks pretty unitextural. You can also see here that there's like the line on it where it was trussed, which is not bad, but I do think that it ends up having this air of, you know, like it looks like a piece of processed meat more so than a piece of well-prepared restaurant quality protein. And whatever this green element is, whether we call this a puree or a sauce, this better have some flavor to it, because it's got to carry these 2 relatively naked other components on this dish. And you might see that in the ratio here. Like, this might be a very intensely flavored sauce. It's one of the reasons he maybe didn't put that much on this plate. You might often see plates like this come out, and then they will actually have a tableside jus of whatever this protein happens to be, and they will pour that tableside. So you have 2 sauces. I don't think it's bad to have 2 sauces on a dish, but it is a situation where I look at this and I say, it's not going to eat right. The components maybe aren't prepared in a way that is all that guest friendly to eat. And depending on how the flavors kind of meld together when you have that first bite, it might not actually land the way that you want it to. And so then you try to compensate with like different plating things. It's not happening. I know I've talked about the industry being a small world, and I'm very aware this happens in other industries too, not just in food and restaurants, but it is the situation where you sometimes have all this stuff happening behind the scenes, and it culminates to this place where a restaurant closes or a chef leaves somewhere, and it comes out in a news piece. And it can sometimes hit you like a truck because you just have these people pedestaled in your mind as these unshakable beings in the industry, and all of a sudden something bad happens to them too. And so I've totally had the same reaction that Richie has when you see a piece of news and you're just like, dang.
Foam?
That's a Bernays. I don't fucking know.
No, it's cool. It's like 2014 or something.
It's good?
It's excellent.
Yo,
but
Chef.
Yeah.
You got caramel recipes?
Yeah, New York notebook on the shelf.
Thanks, Chef.
it's pasta for tonight.
I don't know, we have to see what tea brings back. I was thinking potato gnocchi.
Yeah, maybe with the beef cheeks.
Good. Yeah, done.
Great.
Fast scene, but a couple of points I wanted to cover there. The first is Marcus asking Carmen for the caramel recipe. And we have already touched on the idea of like when recipes are chronologically in your journey and how you document those. That's Carmen saying in the New York book, you need to go and find this recipe. He knows that he's going to have to present this dish to Carmen to get approval of eventually. So it's better to just go to the source and say, hey, do you already have a recipe on this that you happen to like? Maybe is using different types of sugars so that we can achieve a texture that's better than anything that I'm going to find on somebody's recipe blog. That's maybe a little bit better of a way to circumnavigate the recipe development process as you're presenting dishes to the person who's going to actually make that final call. Secondly, talking about Tina coming back from the farmer's market, we're going to do potato gnocchi. And in a couple episodes back, you're really pushing yourself to change the menu every single day, and we need to be inspired with every single thing that you do. And you get to this place where you're either just really tired of doing that every single day, or you've gotten to the place where you've almost plateaued on the number of creative ideas that you're doing, or you sometimes get negative returns on coming up with new ideas and you're trying things while leaving some things that are working on the bench, which leads me into the béarnaise sauce for the lamb going in an ISI canister, which is like almost this third wave of derivations on mother sauces, because you have the mother sauces and then you had people creating sub recipes from those mother sauces like béarnaise sauce. And then you have people saying, how do I make this even more luxurious? How do I make this a texture that nobody's ever had before? Let's use some of these modern tools like having cartridges and you add air to it and then it comes out in this really voluminous sauce in a way that somebody was whisking in a bowl over a double boiler wasn't able to achieve before. Sydney's kind of right that like 2014 is the year that she references, but anywhere from like 2009 through 2015 was that era of we had all the new tools, we had the hydrocolloids. I'm going to say like I don't mind a ISI béarnaise sauce. I think that any of those sauces, hollandaise is another example, that is really delicious if you season it well and if it happens to be paired with a dish where hollandaise is an actually good accompaniment to that, I don't have a problem with it. And it's just another example of why simple is so challenging. Is it simple and impressive? A beautifully cooked piece of lamb and a béarnaise sauce. And depending on where that goes in the tasting menu, that might be the big meat. And you're really building up to this place and you're really, really excited for this meal. And you've heard about all these techniques that these folks are doing at this restaurant. And that's what you end up putting on the plate. And it can sometimes fall flat for people because simple doesn't always equal extraordinary. And the last piece on Sydney's question to Carmen about what was it like to work for Chef Terry, it must have been so amazing. You were able to be a part of this thing. And you do end up, after working at these places, having like almost a love-hate relationship with that restaurant or with that chef or with your time there, because it's not always sunshine and rainbows. You sometimes have a lot of really challenging moments in your career that you can reflect back on at that restaurant. And you'll see it play out later on in the season, and I'm sure we'll cover it later in this video when that ends up happening. But it's not always when people ask you, oh, it must have been so cool to work at XYZ place. It doesn't always conjure up the best memories.
Not much. What happened?
They don't got much. Market's dead.
Yeah, bummer. What do we have?
T, you might run an inventory real quick?
Yeah, sure.
I can't remember. Have I talked about this? When I was back in my pop-up days, I used to have somebody who did this on behalf of the business. It was actually the person who did like this art right here. She had a degree in sustainable food systems, was super up on what farms had what at different times, because as you've seen, Carmen has a bunch of other stuff he has to keep track of. And even if it is in season, it doesn't necessarily mean that the farms that you're getting stuff from have enough stock or the quality is the way that you want it. Maybe the size of the produce that you're getting needs to be a certain way in order for it to work on the dishes that you're doing. And so having someone who can be on top of that just because it takes so much time is really, really valuable. And then it has this flow-on effect in the restaurant, in the business, on the menu, when you ultimately say, oh, well, we can't actually do the dish in the way that we normally do it because the produce isn't the same way that we expected. And maybe that's not even size related. Maybe it's like stone fruit happens to be a little bit too acidic because it's not quite ripe yet. And so it can be this really ironic moment where you as the chef almost like run into this wall of Mother Nature, and it causes, you can have all the ideals in the world for what you want to have on the menu that day or that night, but then you are obviously greeted with this moment, and now you have to change your plans.
You know what we should be doing?
Produce vendor. You don't have to say it.
Exactly. Then something like this happens. You are greeted with that inconsistency maybe one time, maybe several dozen times, and you eventually get to this place where you say, well, can I solve this problem? And there is a market participant called a produce vendor that solves that problem. You get incredibly consistent produce. You can get daily deliveries. You don't have to send a staff member to go get the stuff. And so then you have all of this layering on as a benefit to the business, but then you take a look at yourself and you say, well, I look just like everybody else in town. This is removing myself from the ethos that I started this project on, where I wanted to have a relationship with farmers. And so I'm not saying it is a binary one or the other. You're working with big box produce purveyors, or you're going to the market every single day to pick stuff out yourself. There's certainly a way where you can kind of meld the two. And I've certainly worked in restaurants and even had my own business where we would kind of do a combination of both. You're getting the main staples and the things that you need to consistently have be in one way, shape, or form from those purveyors. But then, yeah, you're doing something where you're going to the market once a week. And yeah, as a business owner, you're looking at this and saying, we're doing all this extra effort, and we can't always have this be passed along in the price of the menu because somebody else from just down the street is doing the produce purveyor, way of doing things. They're not doing all of this extra work to go to the farmer's market, and they're charging the same price that we are. And so now that becomes a factor, and you have to think about those things. It's also an incredible upfront investment to certain businesses, but that's why you see certain restaurants having farms. Because I guess you could kind of forecast with the farmers you're working at the farmer's market, but if it's your farm, you have maybe at least a little bit of extra forecasting space to see what's coming down the line, and you won't have to run into as many of these problems. But then the counter argument is it's not reasonable for every single restaurant to have their own dedicated farm. And so I see all sides of this. I'm just trying to illuminate the problems and the multifactorial nature of what's playing out on screen here.
How's it going, Chef?
Thank you, Chef. Yeah.
Brussels sprouts, which, by the way, always has a capital B and always ends in an S, which is a geographical reference more so than anything else, but it is a pet peeve that I have when I see menus where they have lowercase b and it doesn't end in an S. Just fun factoid there. And the other detail that's playing out in this scene, which is just a fascinating moment when you're working in professional kitchens, is this idea of the way that a dish is plated and how I talk about the how does it eat factor in a dish can totally change when you just layer things differently. When I call it the order of operations inside Total Station Domination, what do you start with on the plate versus, what is a middle section of plating versus what is something like a finishing move. You saw Tina basically doing a ladle of that green sauce at the end, and it was kind of splotchy, and it didn't really uniformly make its way across the different vegetables. And Sydney's coming up and saying, well, this is not only going to eat better, she's not saying that directly, but that's how I'm perceiving it, by taking the spoon, and you're also making it a little bit more operationally sound. You also see in that scene, Tina had a little bit of that green sauce on her finger on the spoon as she was plating the puree. That's a little minor detail, but that stuff matters because you have portion control a little bit easier. That green sauce is going to be the same across every single plate that you're plating up during service. When you're using something like a spoon versus a ladle, it's not these like gloops that are just, you're relying on gravity, having the puree fall off of the ladle onto the vegetables, but you have the ability to spoon exactly where you want it. And then you use the back of that spoon to really spread everything out, and so nothing is either under sauced or it is completely covered and coated in sauce. And then aesthetically, it plays into the factor too, where it just looks more visually appealing when a dish is plated in that way. And so you might have a dish on your menu now that is, for all intents and purposes, everything's right? Like you don't have to change the technique. You don't have to change the proportion of things. You might just need to plate it differently. And I have a whole video on the second channel where I talk about different styles of plating layouts. And so you might do that as an exercise after you watch this video, is you take a dish that you have, you're plating it in a linear way. Maybe there's a world where you can have it be in a condensed format instead.
I thought it would be there forever.
Yeah.
I know we kind of talked about that bittersweet feeling, the love-hate relationship when you hear that a restaurant that you've worked at in the past is dying. I just wanted to clarify here that Ever, the restaurant that they're referencing, is not closed. So that restaurant is still very much so open in Chicago. It is a fictional, again, Franken restaurant that I think we've talked about in previous episodes that is playing out on screen here. So I wanted to clarify that. I also thought it's interesting to think about like success in relation to longevity in restaurants, because you have these teams having these feats of achievement and the awards and the accolades and experiences that they can provide. But it is this funny situation where like the vast majority of restaurants, quote unquote, die. They end up either going out of business, or the owner moves on to something else, or unfortunately passes, or something negative happens in the restaurant, whether it's a lawsuit or a bankruptcy that ends up happening, and then that business ultimately ends up dying. And so all of these are almost like fleeting ideas. They're non-permanent businesses. And you put that in relation to other companies that can have like multi-generational long runs. You don't often see that in restaurants. There's of course examples. I think I've talked about on the podcast before about this really, really old restaurant in Spain that is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years old. There's certainly restaurants that I have either wanted to go eat at or wanted to go work at that are just not available anymore. They are closed. And so I kind of have that in the back of my mind of anytime that I have a restaurant that I'm excited about eating at, and I have the opportunity to, even if it feels like a stretch financially or I have to make a sacrifice to make the trip end up happening, I ultimately try to do it because I just have too many regrets in the rearview mirror of, man, I wish I would have actually gone and eaten at that restaurant, because you never know. It can really sort of blindside you and come out of the middle of nowhere. There's certain businesses that do try to take advantage of this concept. I think Grand Achatz' Next in Chicago is kind of a pushback against this idea. And so Next is a restaurant, for those that don't know, that changes its whole entire concept 4 times a year. Obviously, it's operating within the same 4 walls, but they might do, I think that one of their first menus was like a Paris 1906 menu. And then they went into like Sicily and then Kyoto, and then they did almost like an homage to El Bui's menu at Next. And they're constantly changing. I think currently they're doing almost like a tribute to Massimo Bottura right now. That's, again, this idea of it is this fleeting thing. We're going to acknowledge that that's the case. And so we're actually going to build our whole entire business around it's available now and it's going to go away. So there's almost like engineered scarcity built into the business, as opposed to this idea of we're just going to keep this up as long as we can, and whenever we can't, we're going to close the restaurant.
The photographer will be here in like half an hour.
Obviously, there's different ways that this can end up playing out in real life. What we're seeing play out on screen is the version of an anonymous or pseudonymous critic comes in. Maybe they're wearing a disguise and someone at the door wasn't able to recognize them based on the face sheets that they had in the office that we've talked about in previous episodes. But they have their meal. they come back and they write about it and they decide, okay, maybe based on the multiple meals we've had and we know this is consistent enough or this is a splashy enough opening for us to write a piece on it. Now we need photo assets that are ours, the publication's photos that we're going to use, and it has to come in a close enough proximity to when the meal was, because whatever that critic is writing about, they need photos of it to be able to reference, but it might still be like several days or several weeks out from when that review is actually going to drop in the publication. And so you're in this weird limbo where now you know that the person has come to eat, you can't go back in time and change any of that, and you don't ultimately know what they're going to say about you, but you still have to like show up and participate and plate up the food. And so you don't know if you're plating something up and they're just going to completely bash it. So you could have like the best quality mise en place that you can have. I talk about it in Total Station Nomination, this like photo shoot level of food on the results spectrum, where it is just like the best langoustine tail and the only perfectly sized beet that happens to go on the plate. And we dress it just in a way that we never would be able to do during service because it is photo shoot level. And then several days later when it drops in the publication, the critic is just like, this is one of the worst dishes I've had this year. And you're just like facepalm. I swear they bait me with the tape dispensers and the scissors every season, man.
I remember he took the SD cards without permission.
Who are they talking to?
That's in the fucking fuckery, bro. Computer, continue. And remember, when you get to the numbers, say them real slow.
Passive aggressive.
Aggressive.
Sick, right?
Yeah, sick. What is that, like leather?
Polyester, you fucking idiot.
I know I'm not the channel to talk about the cinematography elements of this show, but I do think it's kind of cool to see the dichotomy of both of these scenes playing out at the same time. You have the facts doing the hard labor of buffing the floor, making sure all the details are right, the sweeping, the mopping, the working the heavy machinery on one side of the wall. And then on the other side of the wall, you have computer talking to the entire leadership team about the finances and how things are going. You're sometimes being the one who's doing the buffing of the floors, or again, whatever role you're in, you're cleaning the countertops, or you're scrubbing the equipment, or you're cleaning out the walk-in downstairs, and everybody else is in the private dining room having the finance meeting, and you can sometimes feel like you're like othered by that scenario, but they're all interconnected. They can sometimes butt heads, but it is this funny reality of being in a restaurant. Also, I'd love to hear in the comments if you have a different take on this, but we do not have smoking sections in restaurants anymore for those that have been living under a rock. And so for especially a restaurant of this caliber, especially for the publication that's going to be reviewing them, who are going to be coming in just a couple of minutes or a couple of hours, smoking a cigarette, multiple cigarettes in the dining room is just absolutely unheard of to me.
You always smoking here. Not anymore, G. Put that shit out.
Why is the R&D cost so high?
Menu development.
Maybe we develop a little less.
Why don't you just tell us to do everything a little bit less? We can skip this and get...
We've seen multiple factors play out in this episode, from the availability at the farmer's market to the pushback from your investors to the way that the P&L actually ends up coming out at the end of the quarter. And that is how the slippery slope into mediocrity or vanilla restaurants end up happening. It is one giant story of incentives and managing multiple factors and ultimately running a business. And that's why I talk about the progression from cook to chef and then chef to entrepreneur. And I make that distinction because the skill sets are different. And I use the word skills very intentionally. You can learn these things. You can become better at them. And if you don't, it's going to hit you like a truck, like it is happening to Carmen on screen right now.
Why are you renting additional sets of black napkins?
In fairness, I often request a black napkin.
How come?
Because I like to wear a lot of black.
I had this professor in culinary school who gave this whole lecture to us, and she was talking about how Michelin evaluates restaurants. And obviously, because that was my goal at the time, I was incredibly like on the edge of my seat. I was really paying attention to this talk. And she gave this example of extra steps of service that provide what she called something like an X factor or a wow factor when you're at one of these restaurants. And one of those steps of service that has proliferated the industry is this idea that if you're wearing a black suit or even just a black pair of trousers or a black dress shirt, and you are given a white napkin by the front of house person to sit with at your table, that napkin, because of the way that it's washed, as long as it's not brand new, is going to have little fibers, lint, effectively, that when you ultimately go to stand up to maybe use the restroom or go do your kitchen tour, you are going to have this embarrassing collection of lint on your outfit because you were given a white napkin. And so what some of these restaurants decided to do is, let's do a dark napkin. Sometimes a black napkin is what you'll see. And so if my wife and I go out to eat and she's wearing a floral print dress, she's going to get a white napkin. And if I'm wearing black trousers, I'm ultimately going to get the black napkin. napkin. So even if there is lint, if that lint collects on my outfit, it's not going to show. This is opposed to, we're going to like lint roll every single napkin. And I've talked about it in other content before. You pick up all of these things along the way and you say, that's maybe a little bit too over the top or exorbitant. And maybe I'm not really all that excited to have that in my restaurant. But then you have this example where it's like, hey, I kind of like the black napkins, or I like the daily changing menu. And so all of that weaves its way into the concept when it ultimately is the day for you to have your concept someday.
It's a plate that nobody eats off of, and then you still have to wash it anyway.
That's
yes. No, fuck that shit. No charger.
The person who kind of had a claim to fame on this isn't the only person who did this, but he wrote about it in his book, which is an interesting story, is Grant Achatz, when he was coming from these white tablecloth, traditional French service type of places where it was kind of expected what you see on the table when you go and sit down. And he was asking some of these questions because he was a startup restaurant. He had an investor that he was beholden to. And it's a real conversation of, do we need to have white tablecloths that we spend time ironing and we're paying for the linen service on this and we need the charger plates on the table? Or can we maybe just strip everything back? And it's almost like a zero-based budgeting idea of like strip everything back to zero and then only add in what we need to have, not start from this place of, well, we need to have all of these things and maybe we'll cut down. It's just an interesting perspective of how you might construct your restaurant.
Just because the beef stand's finally making money does not mean you can make your own ketchup.
I mean, it's gross.
Absolutely agree. I'm so glad that the show brought up the idea of making it your own ketchup in-house so that I can go on this rant and just finally get it on the record and out of the way. Let's back up and talk about why. Certain restaurants like to serve French fries. They're delicious. I don't mind having French fries on a restaurant menu. I think it's great. Certain dishes, whether it's moule frites or steak frites, or you're going to have a sandwich and you're going to serve fries on the side, amazing. I don't push back on that at all. What's the most frequently requested condiment with French fries? Ketchup. Secondly, a guest asking a front of house person, can I please have some ketchup, is something that is going to come up whether you like it or not. And now you all of a sudden have two things at odds with one another. So on one hand, you have, we are charging $150. The sandwich place down the street is charging $15. We are 10x the price. And we are also serving the same Heinz ketchup as them. That feels a little bit weird. So you start to just have these thoughts, these shower thoughts of like, maybe we need to be making our own ketchup, or is there a more expensive ketchup that we can be procuring to serve to guests? And then on the other hand, you have all of these other sauces that we're making, all of these other purees, all of these condiments that we're serving as part of the tasting menu we make in-house. And so you feel this misalignment of, why are we buying ketchup? And you just have this thought, or you bring it up in a menu meeting, or you are talking with your sous chef and you say, we should make our own ketchup too. And I think just the fact that this is playing out as a meme on screen here makes me think that we have kind of overcome this problem, and this can become a thing of the past of restaurants deciding to make their own ketchup. But I see when chefs put their brain into trying to solve this problem, falling into one of two problems that ultimately go at odds with what people actually want with this product that is tried and tested in the market and people know that they love it, which is just traditional ketchup. Is the first one, they go to preserved tomato, heirloom tomato from the farmer's market. We're dehydrating them ourselves. And if you actually look at the ingredients on the back of a Heinz ketchup bottle, it starts with tomatoes from concentrate, distilled vinegar, and corn syrup. And so if you're not using those as the base ingredients of your ketchup, you have already severely departed from what the traditional condiment is. And so I've just had it too many times where they decide to use really high quality ingredients, not understanding that the ingredients in Heinz ketchup is just very bare bones. And they do it from concentrate so that it can be very consistent. And then you just have the flavor profile of the ketchup ultimately being lackluster or not what you're expecting, and then it just feels like a letdown. And so the flavor profile is the one qualm that I have with it. And then the other qualm that I have with it is the fact that most restaurants, when they make their own ketchup in-house, decide to omit the xanthan gum. I'm so glad you asked why xanthan gum matters. It's because, remember, we talked about French fries being the most common thing that people use ketchup for. Where do French fries come out of? A hot fryer, whether using oil. And so the coating on the outside of those French fries is a lipid. That becomes a problem when you have your ketchup that does not have any xanthan gum in it, and you're going to try to dip that French fry into this incredibly water-based condiment. Now, all of a sudden, the ketchup does not stick to that French fry. And now you have this really disappointing experience where you can't get enough ketchup on the French fry and everything's just falling off. And so both factors, the flavor profile as well as the eating experience, what does the ketchup do, the utility, the function that it needs to provide in the context of what's on the table, it does not happen. It's one of those few things in restaurants and food. I think you can probably think of others and let me know it out in the comments where it is one of those if it ain't broke, don't fix it things when it comes to ketchup.
Anyway.
Hey, Chef Sid, could you please tell Chef Carmen to prep the duck dish that we probably only made once for the photographer?
So we already talked about the paradoxical problem of you don't know if the critic is going to praise or bash this dish that you're going to plate up for the photo shoot. You also don't know what set you're going to serve with it. And so you have this other problem of maybe it is something where the critic talks positively about one thing, but the photo looks like something else. And the person who's reading that review is going to be like, well, this restaurant looks really inconsistent. That's something that people don't often talk about with the ever-changing menu side of things, where you also, and I think I've talked about this before, you want to go macro and think about consistency across the entire experience, but then you can have variation in the dishes that you're ultimately serving that maybe go with the seasons. And ideally that happens. The critic is incredibly well experienced and they have some nuance that can come across in their write-up. And so they say, the duck dish that I enjoyed was with strawberry and rhubarb, and the duck dish that's pictured here is with plum and pink peppercorn. And they can give that context and say the Bear is a seasonal restaurant, and so what they end up putting on the plate really ebbs and flows with what happens to be growing at the time. And then you're met with, I'm going to call this an eye roll moment, where Nat is saying, oh, we can just go send somebody to go get a duck. And if you're going to go to a butcher shop and that duck is going to be packaged in plastic. And so what might sometimes happen in these cases is Carmen might have a restaurant homie who he knows happens to have duck on their menu, and he'll say, hey, can we send somebody by to get a duck? That's much more likely to happen than we're going to try to get this duck that is still wet and not prepared in the same way that we would traditionally age this thing. And then whatever we're going to try to prepare is not going to come across because it's a 14-day process that we can't expedite. And that's if they're serving breast. If they're serving leg and it's a traditional confit that is a couple-day process, or you need to sous vide it even for a couple of hours if you're going to try to expedite that with some more modern tools, it's not really something where you could just pull it out of your back pocket and serve this duck dish. We have all the mise en place on hand and it's ready to go. And so unfortunately, this is one of the worst outcomes you can expect when a photographer comes in and requests a dish that, one, nobody knows what's on it, and two, you don't have the ingredients for it, and three, if you are going to recreate one of these things, it takes more time than the photographer ultimately has, and so you feel rushed. And so what's more likely to happen, what's more typical, is the publication will reach out, they'll say, hey, we're coming by at this time, the photographer would like the opportunity to photograph XYZ dishes if possible. So they're trying to portray that this was lost in translation, there was a miscommunication that ultimately ended up happening, and that's why they don't have anything on hand to ultimately serve what they need to serve.
I mean, he makes two things, so that makes him too expensive.
Okay. What do you want me to do about it?
Do you need a pastry chef?
That's Marcus.
Do you need a Marcus?
Yeah.
Please sign off in the comments if you're a pastry chef and you're watching this and this scene particularly stung for you, because I know that that's not a good feeling. I have worked on both sides of, definitely more on the savory side in my experience. The proportion of pastry experience that I have is very few and far between. And so thankfully people have been making their voices heard on this fact in the industry. You have the people talking about more, it's almost like a meme now, the like chefy desserts, where the savory chef or the head chef is the one that's responsible for putting the 1 or 2 or 3 dishes on the menu that are on the sweet side of things, and they go back to their culinary school notebooks, so they go back to the basics or the things that are not technically complicated on the pastry side of things, and that makes the dishes and the dessert side of the menu feel incredibly lackluster, really boring, or again, just like not technically on par with what's happening on the rest of the tasting menu. That's because you have failed or you've omitted the pastry chef from the team. I've been covering hospitality news for like almost a decade now, and so I've seen this pendulum swing in one way or the other, and so you'll have this thing where the opening team has a pastry chef and they develop a bunch of recipes for the restaurant, and then this conversation happens where we need to do some cost-cutting measures, and we realize that the pastry chef is the one who's sending out the free birthday cake for people, and the petit fours are just an afterthought that we are sending with the check at the end of the meal. And so you have this meeting and you get out of it and you say, well, yeah, we can cut this person from the program. We have all the recipes already. I'm not arguing one way or the other. You certainly have examples where organizations have taken the pastry chef away and they have become more financially successful, or they notice that guests don't order dessert that much. And so our business is actually doing fine without a pastry chef. But you ultimately have to look at them as this person is a specialist in the same way that a sommelier is a specialist. And this person is actually going to have an impact if that's going to be something that you pour resources into and you're utilizing this specialist properly in the business. And I would argue, again, I'm going to be on the side of Marcus here, one, because he's a great character in the show and I don't want to see him go away. But secondly, this is a restaurant that can actually benefit from a great pastry program. And you're seeing that happen in some of the dishes that Marcus is able to create. And so if I'm going to be working with the Bear in a consulting capacity, Marcus needs to stay on the team. But I don't think it's something where you can paint with such a broad brush where you say, well, just because a pastry chef doesn't work at XYZ restaurant means that we need to eliminate pastry chefs across the board and they need to ultimately go away.
We need a Marcus.
Can you get it cheaper, Marcus?
Computer.
Natalie.
If you fuck with Marcus, I will murder you.
One other quick point that came to mind as I was thinking about Marcus, there was work done on experiences, and they were talking about how things like the duration of the experience and the first thing that they experience versus the last thing versus the middle and their anticipation leading up to the experience. And this was more talking about like going to the doctor or going to the dentist. But one thing that really stood out that sticks in my mind is the last thing that you experience disproportionately affects how you remember whatever happened to you. Marcus's work, the dishes he puts up, is going to be one of those last things that you remember, and it is, again, scientifically going to affect how you remember your experience going to eat at the Bear. And so I look at that and I sometimes invert it, and I start to think sometimes I've been out to eat at restaurants where everything is really, really phenomenal in the menu, but they just mailed it in on the desserts. Or there was something on the flavor profile of like one of the petit fours that was just like maybe just a little bit off. And for whatever reason, that stays true to me. I remember that a little bit more strongly than whatever the second savory course was on the tasting menu. And so I'll try to find that and I'll link it in the description if you need a little bit of evidence to back yourself up in your argument that you do need to have a strong specialist pastry chef as part of your team if it ends up working at your concept and it makes sense.
Out of high school, so I know department stores. Oh no, for sure. Just let me know if you hear anything.
Small disclaimer as we go through this episode, we're going to go through it pretty fast. I didn't have that many notes as I was going through this episode of what I wanted to talk about culinarily. There's not many of those scenes. I know that narratively I really enjoyed this episode. They actually gave other team members ability to like produce or write on this episode, and so it feels a little bit different from other episodes. I love the background it gives on Tina. I did write that it makes sense why Tina got psyched about culinary school, because she, just given her background after we learn a little bit more information about her, she had this problem applying for jobs and feeling like she didn't have the qualifications to go into any sort of specific industry and just say, here's why I'm qualified, here's why you should hire me. And so in previous episodes or seasons when she got the opportunity to get a formal education on something, I can see why that makes sense for her. Again, I still kind of push back on the sense that after having worked at the Bear in the capacity that she has a ton of industry experience, where also in an industry where a degree doesn't mean as much. And you can see that in the end of this episode where she gets the job even despite having not had any experience or a degree.
Chichi, take register.
I feel him coming.
Dude, there's literally zero chance he clears this level.
Yeah, there's a strong probability.
Dude, there's no fucking probabilities like gravity, fact. And you cannot negotiate with gravity.
So I have to love the flashback a little bit, do you not? Going back into the old Bear location in the time that I've been covering the show on YouTube, going back into the time when they just served sandwiches and all the old characters and the video game machines. There's something about that I think is weirdly a little bit nostalgic for me to see. But you see Tina being very emotional eating this. I call these like swearing bites, where you have a bite of food served by somebody and she's obviously in a very emotional state from being so troubled and trying to find a new job and trying to find work. There's also a little bit of an expectation factor coming into this, where it's just a humble sandwich shop. How good can it be? It's almost like you didn't bring that many expectations into this first bite. And so it can be this like very, again, five senses moment, and it just overtakes you. And again, I talk about it more from the sense of you eat something and you're just like, man, I start swearing at myself, because it's like, how did this person manage to weave these flavors together and figure out the texture just right? And maybe the environment plays a little bit into it, and your own state when you're sitting down in that chair. I just resonate, having had several bites in my life where I have this type of reaction, maybe not exactly shedding tears, but it is something where it just takes over you, and it is just, you're so present and you get to enjoy food in the way that the person maybe intended, maybe didn't even intend, but it's the mixture of all of those factors together playing out in this moment that just really sticks with you and you remember it is really cool. And the second point on this that I just wanted to touch on is, before you get a job somewhere, eat if you have the chance, because it will give you so much color and additional context, and you get to be on the guest side to empathize a little bit more. I can just speak from experiences I've had where I've staged at places and they have either come and gone and I haven't gotten a chance to eat at places, or the opposite happens. I stage before I eat somewhere and I feel like I have so much more information on seeing the full picture of the tasting menu, seeing how front of house plays a role, seeing how the beverage program integrates. Or maybe it's a case of I start working somewhere and I don't eat there until 3 months into the job, and I feel like I just have these regrets of I wish I would have done that sooner. And so her doing this, I think, is like 2 thumbs up for me.
Sucks, you know, because I was about to ask him if we could move to a net 60. So instead of having that lovely conversation, now we got to talk about a payment plan. And I guess number three on just like sort of a general kind of like macro level, we don't have enough people working here. So the people that are here just kind of getting shitty towards each other because we are like constantly fucking rock.
Unless your situation is like you're going to go into your family's business, you have a choice in the industry of what type of place you want to work at. And I think what this show does a really good job of showing is that from the casual sandwich place all the way to the 3 Michelin star fine dining situations, it's problems all the way down. And so I think what is better off being spouted as a piece of advice is just go to a place that you're genuinely excited about being, not trying to mitigate or trying to tell yourself this fallacy that if I go to this place or if I manage to land XYZ position, and you get to thinking I will no longer have struggles or challenges anymore. I just think that this scene is totally exemplifying that.
I have an actual resume.
What the fuck am I gonna do with a resume? I'll go clean the toilet with a fucking resume. I don't need a resume. I talk to you.
I know I talk a lot in these breakdowns about the fine dining side of things because that's the experience of mine that most people want to hear about. But not a lot of people know that when I moved to Seattle and I started doing pop-up dinners, my side hustle, the way that I paid most of my bills, was through working on a food truck. And a lot of the stuff that he's saying about like coming home and smelling it, and it's a lot of yelling, and you can make a bunch of money in tips, all of that was experience that I was able to get at that short stint at a food truck that I worked on. And so I kind of have a little bit of fondness towards hearing him say that, because it is like the people are so fun. And on the days when it's fun, it is actually a blast. I think I've also used the anecdote before that people think we're in the food business, but we're in the people business. I think that's being echoed on screen here as well. This also might seem like a niche message, but I know Tina said she's 46. She feels like she's old. She's talking about the kids that are in the workplace compared to where she's at age-wise. And I get DMs like that, people who are saying, hey, I am either transitioning jobs or going from one career to another and changing industries, and I feel like I'm too old because I'm looking at line cooks who are 23 and I'm 31. Obviously, this is a fictional TV show, and 46 being the age that most people start is not the norm. I will certainly say that most people do start young, but I don't think it's any sort of disqualifier unless you have some sort of qualms with physical labor and being in the kitchen. I'm not in any way trying to say that like, oh yeah, everybody can work in kitchens. It is something where you have to kind of be cognizant of what the work demands of you, and you can bring those up in conversation with your employer to make sure that you're finding a place that is going to align with what you're physically able to do. I also think certain businesses are doing a good job of providing some infrastructure to make the job inherently less physical. That might take the place of, you know, hiring cleaners to come in overnight when the restaurant is closed to do something like clean the hoods. I've had to do that at restaurants that I've worked at. Or maybe it's something small like getting a cart. And so when the delivery comes in, you don't have to just take all of these boxes and bags and carry them yourself down the hallway into the walk-in or to the dry storage. You have the ability to load up a cart, wheel it all the way over, and then that makes the job a little bit less physically taxing and ultimately faster. He's also doing this really interesting principle in hiring, which is called like selling someone on not taking the job, saying all of the downsides, all of the negatives, all of the bad parts that come with it, whatever this role happens to be. And if that person is still jazzed and excited, then maybe they're a good fit, because at least you're just showing all the cards. You're not painting this thing out to be something that it's not. And that's beneficial because that makes sure that person is there for the right reasons. You can kind of develop this rapport amongst like, I'm not going to gaslight you. I'm going to be very transparent. You can come to me with things as your boss. And just getting additional context to, oh, this was the day when Carmen sent Mikey the image of him at Noma doing XYZ dish.
Great.
Yeah, got the backers of ever, but I'm not, I want to start clean. I don't want to inherit anything. I don't want to cook every day, but I want to run it. And I want to hire a CDC. Somebody who can come in, build a team, lead it.
There's an interesting moment you reach in your career where in the beginning you're trying to build your resume and you're so hyper vigilant on the formatting of how my resume looks and how it comes across, because kind of in the beginning you don't have anything to fill out your resume and you're just kind of hoping that somebody's going to take a chance on you for something that maybe you're not even qualified to apply for. And you cross this chasm in your career where your network becomes robust enough and the stack of evidence on your experience becomes as such that you don't even need to send out resumes anymore to get opportunities. And so this is absolutely realistic on asking for that quick coffee meeting. It's with somebody who you happen to know from a previous experience or from across town, or they've come in and eat at the restaurant and they know of you and you're being sat across the table from them, and they're offering you this really interesting opportunity now. Please don't get it twisted. I'm not saying go around and tout that I don't need my resume. I'm too good of a hotshot for those sorts of things. But it is interesting at the fact that she didn't need to fight anybody for this position. She didn't need to go through a formal application process. She was actually recruited for this role. Also notice the language of how he's talking about his involvement with the project, where he's saying, I don't want to cook anymore. I want to run it. And so he's looking to kind of like move up, quote unquote, in his career. Sydney's kind of getting to do the same thing, where Carmen is the one who's getting to dictate the concepts and what's on the menu. Sydney gets to weigh in, certainly, and certain dishes that she wants to have on the menu do end up making their way onto the menu. But this is like, hey, blank slate reasonably. You get to choose what these things are. And then I'm the boss who is ultimately removed from the quote unquote cooking side. And you get to be the one behind the pass, making those calls, leading the team, everything he outlined. I will say it's funny to see this like grass is always greener effect play out, where with the bear, it is a family investor and there's a lot of dynamics that are happening that that, maybe make it a little bit harder. Yes, there's money, but they're a little bit feeling tight on money. And then you have this other company that is new and they're well-funded. They have this background with this other high-profile restaurant. I'm really going to get to put my thumbprint on this. This is a new team, but you might swing over to that side of the fence and realize that, man, there's just as many problems here. Or, you sometimes have people get the opposite thing where I'm coming from this really well-funded big restaurant group thing, and I want something a little bit more indie feeling, a little bit more lighthearted, a little bit more like I know my coworkers and we're a little bit more tight-knit. Maybe there's a little bit less media attention on us when we're on the more grassroots side of things. It's just all like people just change their preferences, and if you're in one camp, the other camp can sometimes feel so attractive. I'm just saying this is actually how it plays out sometimes. The rush nature of making a decision, it is beneficial for you in your career to sometimes come up with some of those decision-making frameworks of how am I going to navigate one of these crossroads. And yeah, at the end of these conversations, you can almost kick yourself where you're like, me 3 years ago or 5 years ago would have killed to have had an opportunity like this, and now I just turned this down, or I just said no to this, or how come I'm not excited about this? I've just been here and I totally get it. Little salmon cornet sketch, oysters and pearls, nice.
Then new people would take those parts and they would put them into their restaurant. And the whole thing, it would start to happen all over again.
Carmen's totally right. This idea of parts starting maybe at a restaurant and then through the people who either go off and do their own thing, or they end up leaving and going to be a chef de cuisine of somewhere else, and they get asked to, again, what we were seeing in the other scene, you need to lead the team, you need to organize things. You're going to take what you know works at the place that you're currently working that might be new and novel for that particular area of the world, and you're going to bring that into how the operations run at this new place. And then even down to the nitty-gritty day-to-day tasks like cutting the tape or taping the pass down, or the way that expediting is done, or the way that the callbacks are done in specific kitchens might actually be something that you go into a place and you see that they're doing it in a specific way, and you're like, oh yeah, that's from that place. And you learn about the pedigree of that person and you can trace their resume back, and you're like, oh, it makes sense why you're doing it this way. I think that there's also like this unspoken secondary measure. I think it's really tracked anywhere, but it is like once a chef has reached the top of their game, their restaurant or their concept has all the awards and all the accolades, they've really done everything. And then you start to ask yourself, who has come through and spent time with that chef? And now where have they gone? What have they decided to open? Where are the people who have rubbed shoulders with this person? And what are they up to now? They're just really cool examples. You'll see them posted on Instagram sometimes of the team photo. There's 15 chefs in the picture, and you can point to like 9 of them. And they were just all happened to be at this really high caliber restaurant all at the same time. And you can just go through the photo and you could say, yep, this person has a successful restaurant group. This person went on to earn 3 Michelin stars. This person has a cookbook or a TV show out now. And what's funny and difficult to forecast about those times is that you can't know in that moment that that is one of those times. It's almost like the good old days are happening right now types of things. And so only in hindsight can you realize that like this was the year when all of these people who are just complete savages came through the kitchen. And oh my goodness, it was so cool to be able to work with all of these people where we pushed each other and look at how everybody was also entrepreneurially minded. Sure, a certain number of restaurants have it happen multiple times because they were around for 30 years and you just happen to, again, have these confluences of teams. It's very much like sports in that way.
Take to the fucking customer, fast as shit, without playing around.
You're gonna put the bag right here, so you can do this shit. See how fluid that shit is? It's beautiful. One move.
Gorgeous, that's the key.
Gorgeous.
The sandwich flow is like music to my ears. This is total station domination in action. There's a strategy to the setup. We talk about that in the program, link in the description. And this is what it feels like when you nail it. I just want to fist bump Ibram right now. Don't get me wrong, and I'm not giving shade to Sydney right now because I've totally been the manager that says, my team didn't do this thing right. I'm going to spend the time being outside, getting the boxes all broken down. I think while in the short term, this can look like you're helping your team out, quote unquote, by you're shouldering this responsibility for them. They're inside doing whatever their things are. I don't think this solves the problem long term. I heard another business owner talk about this idea of doing almost like a public display of reteaching the thing and showing that negative side of what happens when we aren't able to adhere to this standard. And so I think another way to address this is more short-term painful, but ideally long-term beneficial, is you just stop everybody and say, hey, everybody come outside. We are all going to empty this dumpster entirely. All the boxes are going to be out. We're going to break them down in the way that we need to have them done to adhere to this standard. They're going to go back into the bin and everybody's going to see what it looks like when it's done properly versus when it's done incorrectly. Again, it seems so nitpicky. It's really easy to roll your eyes. You put it on the list of non-negotiables as something that you want to have on the list. But you see Carmen spending time doing it. You see Sydney spending time doing it. And then what does that eventually roll all the way up into? It is you get so frustrated that when somebody comes and tries to literally poach you from your job, this is one thing that you think about is saying, oh yeah, maybe this would be a place where the boxes would always be broken down, and you leave your job and go work for somebody else. I don't have to explain what this is, but this did stand out as something cool to me because I'm used to drawing my dishes out before something like a pop-up dinner, and that's because it often helps me to do a little bit of that pre-work to decide, okay, does this dish have enough components? Do I need to take things away? And then it ultimately helps me label things, not just so that I can pass it along to team members that I would be hiring for those pop-up dinners, but also so that I can sometimes have it as a reminder of like, don't forget the lemon oil on this fish dish. But I think it is cool to see it where you're taking photos of finished dishes and then printing those out and then drawing on it. That's an interesting operational change that I might actually take into my work and maybe do a little bit more of going into the future. This is a cool idea. And how nice is this to include in something like a recipe database, or even if you can build out a library of like, this is how we like to do dollops of things. And then when we ask for a broken sauce, it needs to kind of look like this. This can, for visual learners, this can really help bring people up to speed. Take aside the fact that it is incredibly nice to have somebody like Nat on the team who is just has the capacity and the ability to go to a restaurant depot and get seafolds when we run out, because I've worked in places where we would get scolded as a team if we ran out of seafolds because we would only get something from the purveyor who would give us the seafolds maybe something like once a week or every other week, and we needed to be on top of ordering those things so that we would not run out of things, especially things like seafolds that are not perishable. It's okay if we have an extra case of those on hand, but not a lot of people know that in a lot of major metropolitan areas, I think the one closest to me is called Chef Store. They've rebranded a couple of different times, and you can go into them even if you don't own a restaurant, and you can buy all of the restaurant quality equipment. There's Cambros in there, there's pots and pans, there's the big slotted spoons, the stainless steel 9th pans and 6 pans, and there's also all of the like deli containers and again seafood containers and big bulk pieces of dry goods. So if you're watching the show and you happen to see some things of like, man, it would be cool if I could have that in my kitchen at home, and you don't work in a professional capacity, you can do this online too. There's like Webstaurant Store is an option, or just going in person, being able to walk around and like get some hands-on time with some of this stuff can be really, really cool.
I want to remind us all that, we are in this together, and every day is day zero, which presents a whole host of possibilities.
Slight change on the every day is the Super Bowl maxim that has been touted around by Richie and the previous places where he has spent time. Every day is day zero is more in reference to, I think, the Amazon company maxim, which is every day is day one, which keeps that team in the mindset of let's make sure that we are not letting other people outdo us. Let's make sure that we're constantly thinking about incumbents, and let's constantly just stay true to our values and not get overlayered with either processes or ways of doing things or mentalities that make it so that we will fall by the wayside in the future. If you're constantly trying to think about out-competing yourself, it makes it so you're less likely to become somebody who's going to get dethroned by somebody else. What you're seeing play out on screen here is that you're often saying the maxim without backing it up with the actual behavior or how does this operationalize in the way that we do things. It can sometimes fall on deaf ears when you say these maxims without actually deploying them in any sort of effective way.
Okay, we could follow that with the hamachi.
Hampachi, I think.
Well, then we'll do the ribeye. Cap. Cool. And serve it with the cherry.
No, I think the apricot's working well.
Yes, chef.
Cool. Thank you, chef.
I've been here. I know this feeling. I know that what's playing out here is needing to kind of show that Sydney's getting even more angsty about either signing this agreement or leaving and going to work with Shapiro on his concept instead. But I do teach this concept because I think it matters. When things are arbitrary, when it could be apricot, could be cherry, it could be cavatelli, could be raviolo, I think you need to defer to the person who has closest proximity to the concept, which in this case is Carmen, to make that final call. And until that changes, until Carmen moves proximity-wise away from the concept and Sydney's role requires her to actually be the one that's closest to that concept now, that's what this role requires. And I think I would have pushed back towards this in the past. And yeah, you need to give Sydney more creative control so she can feel ownership of the thing. But the reality is, like, the restaurant is still so new, and Carmen is going to bear the brunt of whatever this review happens to say. And he's already starting to think about some of these pains and some of these factors budging him from all sides, getting him to start to think about things in a different way. And we just saw that Sydney has an opportunity where the role requires something completely different, where it does require her to be that person who is the chef de cuisine, and she's going to have the closest proximity to the concept on the culinary side. And in that concept, when push comes to shove and something's arbitrary and there needs to be a call made, Shapiro's going to look at Sydney and say, what's your call on this? Again, I'm not saying one way is right or the other. I'm more trying to make you aware of the fact that there are different opportunities in the industry, that if you have a hankering for something, there's probably a role that is perfectly sized and perfectly fit for you in that way. I think the problem arises where you want one thing, but the role or the organization requires something else from you, and those things can start to feel square peg, round hole.
On the roof, it's peaceful as can be.
I literally have just a little bit behind the scenes here. I just put a question mark next to episode 8. And so just full transparency, I think I'm just going to skip. This is the first episode, I think, in all of this will be 30 episodes almost of The Bear, where I'm going to skip an episode because there's no culinary action in episode 8. It all happens in the hospital. It's a very narratively driven episode with Nat and her mom. There's a baby that comes at the end of the whole entire episode. So if you folks don't mind, I'm going to skip episode 8. We're going to go on to episode 9 because there's just no culinary action that happens unless we're going to talk about ice chips. And if culinarily you want to talk about ice chips in the comments, please let me know, and I'd be happy to have a conversation with you.
For it truly to be magic, a magical moment, it has to be spontaneous. It has to be something that just happens.
We saw Marcus discover this sleight of hand language in the last episode. Now he's researching a little bit of magicians and magic history. The person who talked about it the most in my coming up was Grant Achatz, and I think it's because he had this idea of dining becoming this almost theatrical experience, and having the stuff that played out at the table being this playing with expectations, spontaneity, surprise and delight. Those sorts of things happening tableside is something that in the traditional world of French white tablecloth fine dining was more about luxury and being pompous. I think the other person who did a reasonably good job of it was like Heston Blumenthal, where he would have something that looked like a clock and then you drop it into a bowl and then it ultimately melted, or his meat fruit idea where it looks like a mandarin orange, but it's actually a liver mousse and you will go ahead and cut into it and it is not at all what you thought it would be. And so the flavors themselves maybe didn't change, but the way that they were presented did change. And then you started to see, again, things that look like one thing, but they're actually something else. Different ways of plating things, whether you would get a box and then you would open the box and it would open again. And just like any of these trends, you have chefs that come along and make brilliant creations that just totally blow your mind when you get to enjoy them. And then you have people on the other end who either do it for the entire meal, there's no restraint in it, every single course is like trying to be this sleight of hand thing, or they just focus on the appearance and the presentation of it and they forget everything that came before them and the flavors are just totally off and it's just not a good experience to eat that thing. This even went as far as I think certain restaurants doing card tricks at the table, like doing a tableside presentation that included a card trick. And I talk about that pendulum swinging a lot because we went a little bit too far in the playful sleight of hand direction and we were brought back with what I would argue is like the new Nordic movement with like slower food preparations like fermentation and moss covered plates instead of, like flashy hydrocolloid stuff.
Just start off by saying I'm grateful.
Dude, giving your notice is so hard. And I'll speak personally on that. I know we're seeing it play out for Sydney in this scene, but I find that you suffer so long in anticipation for having that conversation. It's a hard conversation. Relatively low level member of the team, it's maybe a little bit easier to do when you're in either a management position or you've been at a place for a while. It's something where you feel guilty, you don't want to do it, you wonder, is this going to ruin the relationship? And I'm trying to say this in hindsight because once it happens, it's like it's over. And then, maybe your last 2 weeks, it's a little bit difficult. The last restaurant that I worked at, I gave a year notice. I was really nervous to do it and I didn't want it to be like, hey, this is just 2 weeks. I'm not suggesting that needs to be the normal. What was nice about doing that is that every request that I made or any question that I decided to ask, it put it in the context of the fact that my time was finite at this place and it really had like a hard date on it. And so it made it almost like there was a little bit more urgency behind it, or, yeah, well, we better do this now because you're going to be gone in 9 months. You're going to be gone in 6 months. You're going to be gone in 3 months. Also, I don't know if this would be helpful for anybody, but I can't think of, I'm trying to bring to mind a scenario where I gave my notice and left somewhere that I regret. And I would think back and say, no, I wish I would have stayed for another 6 months. it was typically the opposite for me. I would start to have hankerings or feelings that Sydney's having and say, man, I think it's time. I think it's ready for me to leave. And I would let that extend and go on. And I would almost develop this resentment towards the place that I was working. And I sometimes wish I would have done it sooner. And that was just my intuition guiding me a little bit more, I would say. In other words, I almost inherently knew that I had started to either plateau or stagnate, or that another place got me more excited and I would have been a better teammate at another organization. I think I would also wrongly tell myself these stories of, you know, things are going to go downhill when you leave. You're going to let people down if you leave. And it's always this case of like the show continues to go on even if you leave. You're not as important as you think when you leave a place. And the people who take over in your place, the team that's going to be there when you're not around anymore, they're going to figure it out, and that's okay. And so just like do a little bit less suffering. And so I sometimes wish I would have acted sooner instead of prolonging the inevitable in my career. Quick pause to admire this incredible shot. Very well done.
I can stay later if you need.
No. You should get some rest.
I think you folks saw it. It's like the mosquito in amber on the pass. Am I missing a story here? Why? I understand like it's a paperweight maybe, and it's to keep tickets from blowing around as the door opens and closes or as people walk by the pass. But why the mosquito in amber?
Morning, Chef.
Chef, morning.
How are we doing?
Good, Chef. Good.
Good?
Yes.
First week?
First day.
Really?
Yes, Chef.
And sous chefs have you making family meal?
Yes, Chef.
A lot of pressure, especially roast chicken.
It's pressure. Yes.
We love it. Can I help you? Show you a few things, get you started?
Please.
Good. We're gonna start by showing you how to remove the wishbone.
Yeah.
You can feel the wishbone in there?
Yes.
So it's on both sides. And you know, as a child, oddly enough, it seems like yesterday.
Yeah.
I went to work for a French chef named Roland Hennin, and I was the staff cook. So what you're doing here today is kind of the same thing. And he came to me one day and he asked me, he said, Thomas, do you know why cooks cook? I'm like, okay, I'm trying to think. He said, we cook to nurture people. I know people call me a chef, but our trade is cooking. And that to me is such a profound profession because we get to really be part of people's lives in significant ways.
What a Thomas Keller starter pack way to start episode 10 here. They gave him tons of screen time and dialogue time in a way that I don't think they gave any other of the cameo big heavy hitters that they brought in for season 3 here. And so I wanted to, as someone who has also had a first day at the French Laundry, I wanted to maybe provide a little bit of context and things that I noticed in this scene. So there's a cultural thing that happens at the restaurant, which is called shaking in, and you also call it shaking out when you're leaving the restaurant, where you will say goodbye to everybody on every single station. The only time that it will not happen is if like the service is really in the weeds and you can't go say goodbye to everybody. But you will still sometimes come by to somebody even if they're really focused on doing something like brunoise or they're making cornets, and you'll just kind of like give them a fist bump on the shoulder and say, hey, good night. And you say goodbye to everybody so that it's not this where you feel connected to every single person that's on the team. And Chef Keller exemplifies this when he is in the restaurant, and I just want to make it clear here in this context, he is not at every single restaurant every day. And he can't be. He has Per Se in New York. He has French Laundry in Napa. He has restaurants in Miami. He has restaurants in Vegas. And so there was never really, just speaking personally, an expectation from me that he was going to give me this level of attention when I go to work at one of his restaurants. But it is realistic and consistent on the days when he was in his whites and he was in his apron and he was going to spend some significant time at the restaurant. He does go through and say hi to everybody saying chef. And the joke that I like to tell is the reason he says chef, everybody thinks it's because he respects you and he wants you to be the chef de partie or the chef of the station and take ownership and all those things. I joke that he has so many employees at all of his restaurants that he just can't remember everybody's name. Realistically, that's not an expectation you can put on someone like Chef Keller. And so just saying chef is like, it kind of kills two birds with one stone. You're getting told that you have this title, and then also it helps him to make sure that he's being able to address everybody without saying, what is this person's name again? Also, a little shout out for the cameo. If I'm not mistaken, I'm almost positive this is Courtney Storer. She's the culinary producer on the show. I don't want to, overstep and say that she has become a friend, but like we know of each other. We message on Instagram. I saw her in Copenhagen last month when I was at MAD and Renee Redzepi's food symposium. Thomas Keller was there as well. And so it was cool to see her up on screen, not in the behind the scenes way in all the ways that she helps out on the show. I'm super glad that she decided to make a cameo at this point in the show's history. This is also the French Laundry's real kitchen for those that, maybe I know that we've had Franken restaurants in the past. This is genuinely the French Laundry kitchen after the multi-million-dollar renovation that they had to do. They went through a season where they were actually cooking the 3 Michelin star tasting menu out of a shipping container for a little while. while, for those that don't know that little saga that they had to experience. It also makes sense to me for them to do roast chicken in this scene. They write about it in the French Laundry cookbook as an example of staff food. It was something that we certainly had, but we would also get the onus on us as the brigade to decide what we wanted to do for staff meal for the week, and then we would do all sorts of different types of things. It wasn't always like every single week we need to have roast chicken. What is like Frankenstein, or what I'm noticing, is the like roles and what's happening at this time of the day. So you notice that there's probably 3 people working in the background here, and then there's also Carmen and obviously Chef Keller standing at the pass here doing the chickens for staff meal for the day. I will say that on my first day, I did not make staff meal at the French Laundry. I came in as a commis, and I was in the AM prep team, and so that is typically this size of team in the morning. And you start at 5:30 or 6 in the morning, and it's a sous chef. There's a prep list from the dinner team that was written the night before, and the sous chef in the morning is in charge of effectively delegating all of those tasks out so that the commis in the morning can basically tackle all of those things. So when the dinner team does come in, a lot of those things are either out of the way and done, or they are set up in a way where the dinner team can take those processes from where they have finished from the morning and then execute them into either the evening or something like this for staff meal. I know that is a common thing that happens in other kitchens where during your first week, you are going to get delegated to make staff meal, because I think David Chang has talked about it on podcasts before, that that's a good test of your cooking ability or what you get excited about cooking. I think operationally it just helps you to get a lay of the land, get a sense of where sheet trays are, where Cambros are, where the ice machine is, what stoves can I use, what pots and pans are good to use, when I need certain ingredients or spices, where do I find those? We would throughout the week do different, maybe like an AM breakfast staff meal, and that would be something relatively straightforward, like we'd make a frittata for everybody, and that would get delegated to commis, for example. And this might be an example of, okay, well, Carmen is actually going to do the wishbone and the trussing for everything, and then he's going to give those to the roast station in the evening, and then that person is actually going to go through the preparing of actually roasting them or seasoning them. Or I'm really stretching my memory here. It depended on the day, but it was something like you'd prep for 45 when you were doing staff meal, and that would encompass both the kitchen brigade as well as the front of house and some other people that were maybe on the property that day. The farm people would come over and have staff meal with everybody, and so it was this kind of large format thing. You'd serve it out of like big hotel pans, and I think we're going to see that later on in this episode. But yeah, this might be an example of Carmen is getting the chickens ready via the wishbone processing and trussing them. He's going to hand those over to the roast station, who would be the typical person, meat station, who would be in charge of the proteins, not just for the tasting menu, but then that would be how things would be delegated around for staff meal. And so the entremet person would do the veg for that day, and then the garde manger station would do the salad, or sometimes for me it would be like the cheese station. That was the station I was a chef de partie of, and I would do the salad for the day, and you're in charge of, you know, chopping those vegetables, making the dressing, making sure it was up on time and presented well. A thing I did like to see is Carmen's saving of that demo. I know Chef Keller kind of saved it for him by taking that, you know, wishbone and putting it on, I think it's a 6-pan on the edge, and not inside the 6-pan where it's going to get buried with all of the meat trim that's going to go inside of that 6-pan. You save it, and so that you can reference it as you're doing your wishbones. You're seeing how much meat is cleaned off of that bone. So look at the shape of it. Is there any snapped pieces that may have been left inside of the chicken? What I was kind of disappointed to see is, like, he asked about the Pope's nose, and he goes on that diatribe about the history of that and the anecdotes that he's heard around that, but he didn't really explain why you take the wishbone out. And so at the risk of stepping on Chef Keller's toes here, the reason I was taught by another chef, actually, not Chef Keller, to take the wishbone out of the chicken is because if you've ever done roast chicken, and the way that we would do it is we would do what's called crowning the bird. And so you kind of like, you take the legs and the back off, and so you're effectively left with just the breast sitting on the bone, and it kind of has a little bit of the rib cage underneath it, and I would roast that whole as part of my station. And what happens is when it's time to carve, if you still have the wishbone intact, what happens is you bring your knife up along the breast, and you can't cut through that wishbone, and so you're actually leaving a big chunk of meat on the carcass. And so by taking that wishbone out, if you do it before cooking, it's really beneficial, because now you can just make one clean cut along the breastbone, take the breast and the tenderloin off in one piece, and then you can slice, and then depending on what type of piece you're serving as part of that presentation, it's all intact, and you don't have to do this finagling when you're going to carve the bird when it's time to serve. It's also totally something you can do once the bird is cooked. You just have this problem of here the bird is cold, it's relatively easy to handle, you can get that out of the way, and then you don't have to do it during service, but it's something you can totally cook with the bird in, and then you can take it out after the fact too. And so the staff prep makes sense if they're doing all of this and they're trying to take a little bit of load off of the meat station later on in the day. That makes sense to me. And I think you also saw who is currently the chef de cuisine of the French Laundry
Yesterday.
Yeah.
I went to work for a French chef named
So she's the new chef de cuisine, and she's shown here making the cornets, which I think is interesting because if she would be a sous chef, she would not be making the cornets in this scene. She would be doing things like stock making or getting sauces going or doing some sort of butchery project. And so the sous chefs do not make the cornets. It is a commis that typically makes these. And it is like you saw the silpats having like the almost stains on them due to frequent use of having the molds, and you have to make the batter, and it's butter based, and you're working next to these ovens, and it is like a little bit of a trial by fire where you end up burning your fingers on the cornet molds. It's almost like a rite of passage you have to go through when you're working in these kitchens, and it is something that happens every single day. Maybe not every single day. You try to sprint through the week. So ideally, if you're the person who's going to be making cornets as the commis, you try to really work hard to front load yourself early on in the week. And so if you need to make 100 a day, you'll make something like 130. And so then by the end of the week, you have this really big thumbs up moment where you're like, no, we don't have to make cornets today. That's amazing. Like that's a really good, kind of like positive thing for the team, because it is such, one person is honestly dedicated for probably like 2 to 3 hours in the morning just to making cornets. And it is that involved, and it is that important because everybody is expecting to get that bite at the start of their meal at the French Laundry or at Per Se. The other two, which are like Thomas Keller staples, is brunoise, which is those little small dices you saw them making of the tomato concassé and then some sort of like turnip or celery root. And then you also had big pot blanching, where you have those big, large pots. They're adding salt to the water. They're adding the green vegetables in a small enough quantity where the temperature of the water doesn't drop too much when you add them. And then you ultimately take those with a spider and you put them in an ice bath to shock them. These are all things that are covered in the French Laundry Cookbook and still happen on a daily basis at most of Thomas Keller's restaurants. And I say that because like there's an integrity there. There's like history that happens in the book, and then it also happens in real life at the restaurants. And so it's not a situation where they're saying one thing and what actually happens in the high volume environment is something totally different. Also, the reason I know some of these things is because the French Laundry Instagram account did kind of like a behind the scenes of this whole experience, shooting with Chris Storer and the team at the Bear. And so they posted this on Instagram. And so I'll link it in the description if you're interested in seeing some of those behind the scenes pieces. Chef Keller did like an extra speech. And so I'm of two minds of this scene. It's just cool to me that this show started off as like a portrayal on TV of professional kitchens on the fine dining side of things several years back, and now they're actually shooting in the real French Laundry kitchen with Chef Thomas Keller on screen. They're not trying to make these like pseudo references to him anymore. If you remember way back in season 1, it was like a old kitchen that is, yes, it's a fine dining kitchen, but it's not the real French Laundry kitchen, and they didn't have that access until they managed to get to season 3. And so it's really just cool to see all of that play out. I know I've talked in previous episodes about like company culture and these big authority figures in food and drinking the Kool-Aid, and how I've kind of walked both paths with that. I've also talked in podcast episodes about my frustration with Chef Keller sometimes, and how he kind of sticks with the script sometimes, and how he says the same stories over and over again. But the reason that he does that is because they resonate with people, and because it is something that actually plays out and that he teaches to people in a very intentional way. I know that was a little bit of a longer section to pause and break down, but thank you for letting me indulge. The names are on screen of some of the people that they're shouting out: Christina Tosi, Rosio Sanchez, Daniel Patterson, Roy Choi, Renee Redzepi. Seeing Bradley Cooper on screen was a little bit interesting. As most folks know, he was the chef cast in the movie Burnt, which is notoriously like slammed at frequent points for being just a total exaggeration, or maybe exactly what we don't want to see on screen when it comes to chef portrayals on TV. You do kind of have to brace yourself in this episode for an exhaustive amount of cameos from heavy hitter chefs, but as the Bear has achieved a level of success in the industry just for being accurate and portraying the industry and actually asking the right questions for the consulting chefs to come in and make sure that this is playing out the way that they want it to be seen, and the way that us folks who have worked in these types of restaurants can look at and say, yes, this is exactly how it is. You get to this place where you start to form a pretty awesome network. And what are you going to offer these people but screen time on the actual show? And so I won't lie, there's parts of this episode where I just found myself rolling my eyes like, oh man, really? But it is the one episode where all of the cameos got squeezed in. Yes, there's certain other ones throughout like episode 1 of this season and other interspersed moments throughout the show. But if they're going to have all the cameos happen and flex on the fact that they know all of these people and they're friends with these people, is that more important than the narrative that follows an episode? I don't know. You'll have to let me know in the comments, but it was this funny thing where it was almost like the story took a back seat to how many cool people and friends of ours can we put on screen in this episode.
Because I'm just thinking about needles. So with the truffle explosion, is that injected or is that like set when you make the pasta?
That's set.
Oh, okay.
That one's set.
Oh, okay, because it's just...
What's up with the restaurant? What's going on?
You know, kicking my ass as usual.
Yeah.
You know, I've been a...
Man, both of these conversations that are playing out, why are chef conversations so cringe and awkward? And I'm not knocking the people on screen. I'm saying I fall victim to this too. I even had a chance to meet Will, who's the actor in this, in Copenhagen, and we got to chatting, and I felt the exact same way talking to him as he is talking to Chef Achatz. If I had to point to one reason, it might be the fact that you don't want to talk about your business with other people who have the same business as you, because it's like, you know what I do, and it can sometimes come off as complaining, or like if you're doing really well, it's like, what's there to complain about? And then you're going to listen to somebody else complain the whole time. But then it's paradoxically met with this fact that you don't really do much outside of running your kitchen. And so what else do you have going on that you can talk about? And so you're met with this kind of like weird introvert, antisocial kind of behavior. And it's with these people who like should be able to connect in all these sorts of ways, but it always stays surface level for a number of different reasons.
A soft chocolate ganache, and I put like all these different like dollops on it, and I showed it to Alex, and he was just like...
They do a pretty good job of talking about full names and how different people are interconnected and maybe working at the same restaurant at the same time. You saw Christina Tosi reference Wiley Dufresne. I'm going to take a shot at, I think, what he's talking about here, and folks can correct me in the comments if I'm wrong. This is another example of one of those like heavy hitter seasons at a restaurant. So the restaurant was WD-50, head chef is Wiley Dufresne, the pastry chef was Alex Stupak, who is famed coming from Alinea to be the pastry chef at WD-50, and Malcolm Livingston was working underneath Alex Stupak, and when Alex Stupak left to go open Empillon and his several restaurants under that same name, Malcolm Livingston took over as the pastry chef at WD-50. And I staged for a week at WD-50 when Chef Malcolm was the pastry chef, and that's how I know that.
Dare I say, like, your greatest mistake is working for a bad boss, such that what it unlocks in you is the culture that you choose to create.
We talked about it before, but Christina Tosi's great piece of wisdom there is this idea of a reverse role model. You can go work for somebody and say, these are the things that I don't want to see, in the same way that you might have a positive role model in your experience that says, I want to continue this, I want to do more of this. When I have my own place, I want to do more of this stuff. It's worth harping on again because it can be just as valuable as working for a good boss if you're willing to keep that mindset about you that, okay, cool, this is directionally incorrect, and I want to make sure I avoid this in the future.
Has anybody ever left on the pre-order option? Don't say no like that. Just all sharing stories, I just wondered. I'm just curious.
I remember one time, I got a haircut in the middle of service. And
I don't think I have anything substantive to add to the stories that are being shared around the table right now. I just wanted to pause and make sure that I say that. There's not like me gonna come in here and tell anybody that any of their stories is bullshit or it didn't end up happening, because this seems very genuine, and it seems like conversations I've had either with coworkers or old bosses of mine. So I don't think any of this is off. What I did want to touch on is Sydney's story in particular when she's talking about the pre-order side of things. I do find it funny, and it is mirrored across some of the other people who are talking at the table here, that your worst day story, literally the worst thing that has ever happened to you in a restaurant, eventually, if you give enough time, it becomes something that you can laugh about in the future. And ultimately with people who understand that they've also had their worst day and they can empathize in that way. And if you're willing to be vulnerable and share some of those moments and let yourself process some of those things, it's not something, because you might have had that thing happen to you last week and it still stings. And you might be in this place of like second guessing your decision to be a part of the industry, or you're maybe wanting to take a step back on things, or you're really feeling down about yourself. But I think examples like this, where you're hearing some of the best chefs and operators in the world talk about some of their worst days, I think it's really almost cathartic to hear the fact that they had these really bad things. Those things didn't happen to you, but you're able to take a look at how they're talking about it now and say, okay, they're doing it in this lighthearted way, or they took a lesson from that, then now they're going to say, this is never going to happen to me again. That's just how we learn sometimes. And so I think that that is a really important takeaway from this scene for me, aside from just seeing people, I mean, hopefully like none of this was scripted. It seems like it's a very genuine conversation amongst some people who I've had on my podcast before, or I've worked with some of these people. Again, it's fascinating to me because the Bear is like this fictional world, but now it is like holding so much truth, because you have these real people sharing these real stories about other real people and real occurrences that happened in their career on a TV show that we can all just watch. It's so wild.
Sorry, I forgot my spoon. I'm going to use my watch.
You see my Rolex?
Setting aside the cheesy Rolex joke from Chef Terry here, I haven't ever been a part of one of these like funeral dinners at a restaurant. The closest one that comes to mind that I saw publicly being available was when Manresa closed. And I know that has turned into kind of like its own pop-up style, chef in residence type of concept now. But I'd be curious to hear from your folks' perspective, because sometimes you'll see it play out in one of two different ways. One, it's like this, where it's almost like friends and family again, but it's all the friends you've made and having these restaurants and previous people who have worked there, and those people are the guests who come and eat at the final night. And then sometimes it is a ticketed thing, and maybe it's a last week of service, and there's additional stuff that goes along with it. It's a special, tribute menu, and it's all of the heavy hitter dishes that have been popular throughout the years. I just have seen it been done multiple ways, and so I wanted to just share that in the fact that, yes, this happens, but the way that it takes shape might be a little bit different depending on the restaurant.
Not like a trauma dish, then.
Yeah, it's a big time trauma dish. Messed up thing is I currently make a dessert version.
Really?
Maybe that's an interesting question of the day. Do you have a trauma dish? And if you do, let us know in the comments what it happens to be. I don't necessarily know if I have one. What I will say is on the dishes when I know that I've spent like inordinate amounts of time on them, or I've messed them up a little bit too many times than I'm comfortable with, it does make it weird to sit down and enjoy that dish. Like I've gone to restaurants that I've worked at in the past and I'm presented with a dish that used to be on my station, and it is this thing where you have this different level of appreciation for it because you've spent so much time with each of the individual components of that thing, but then you ultimately end up enjoying it. And if it's a good dish, I still think I can enjoy it. And I think that I've done enough processing where I've gotten to a place where I don't find myself saying, no, I can't enjoy this because I have too many bad memories associated with it. But I'd be curious if people have different experiences, and you can let me know.
Why are you such a fucking asshole?
How am I an asshole?
Do you have half an hour?
You're welcome.
I'm welcome? For what?
You were an okay chef when you started with me. And you left an excellent chef. So you're welcome. Yeah, I gave you confidence and leadership and ability. It fucking worked. You wanted to be great. You wanted to be excellent. So you got rid of all the bullshit and you concentrated and you got focused and you got great. You got excellent.
I'm not as jazzed with the way that this season ends, but I am glad that Carmen got to have this conversation. And I'm also really glad that this is playing out with two professional actors because of the just tension in this scene in particular. I would be lying if I said that I didn't have chefs that I had this feeling towards. I will be fully transparent with you folks and say that I haven't had any of these conversations. I think because I've done enough work to do enough of the processing on my own and not need to do it with the individual. And also those chefs who have done these things in my past experience have also changed and evolved. And I don't think that it would be a conversation with this type of person still. Point number 2, and just being honest, this was a huge motivation in me creating content, is what he's talking about wanting to be great, about wanting to succeed, about wanting to need to be pushed and tested and see where your limits are. All of that I don't necessarily disagree with, because any of those moments, again, because I've done the work to make sure that I'm looking at these moments very fondly now, or at least not in a way that is painful or it gives me ulcers like Carmen has. I look at some of the content that I've made, and what I'm really trying to do, if I'm really boil it down, is give the skills and what he talks about, the ability and the confidence, without the abuse. And so he's saying, look, there's this way that works. And in a lot of ways, he's not wrong, from the sense that it does lead to an outcome. But look at all the side effects. And so I look at that problem and I say, can we solve that without some of these side effects? And that's what I spend my time thinking about. Like on a really, really macro level, I want great restaurants. I want great chefs to be out there in the world doing their thing. But can we do it in a way where it doesn't cause XYZ problems? It's almost a little bit like seeing somebody who has like just like billowing black smoke coming out of their building, and they're saying, look, there's energy being created in there. And I'm trying to come along and say, like, is there an electrical way? You know what I mean? I'm trying to stretch maybe with my analogies here, where it's like zero emissions. We achieve the same result without like polluting everything around us, or, you know, causing toxicity in the inside of the system. I hope that kind of makes sense. I'm also trying not to like excuse chefs like this from continuing to perpetuate this type of behavior in the industry, because it really bums me out when you see somebody who's like really phenomenally talented and one usually it goes one of two paths is the typical way that this progresses, right? You have the one way, which is it burns them out completely or makes them just totally disinterested with being involved in the industry anymore, because getting berated in this way isn't fun for anybody. Or number two, it causes that behavior to go on for another generation. And you see Carmen with some of the flashbacks that he's having where he's like, man, this guy said this to me, and then now I'm saying it to the next person. It takes a lot of mental energy and re-strategizing and seeking out tools to be the type of person who's going to break the cycle. I tried to exemplify that in the work that I did when I was in restaurants, to make sure that anything that was passed along to me does not go on to the next person. And I like to think that I did a pretty good job of it. I don't think you can point to people who are like, man, Justin was the worst chef that I ever worked for. I have shared in other content that I struggled going almost too far the other way, where I didn't feel like I was hard enough on people. I was bad at giving feedback. And so it's not to say that just because you stop being like Joel McHale's character here, that it is a guarantee for your success. I'm all for high standards. I'm all about performance. I'm sure you folks have thoughts on these ideas, maybe this conversation. Again, would love to get into a conversation with you in the comments on this.
Come on, let's get the fuck out of here.
Even the fact that you can just all stand around with a drink in your hand and be sentimental about 3 words on a sign on the wall just makes you realize how much of a bunch of frickin' weirdos we are at the end of the day. And yeah, it's a weird moment seeing this play out on TV, and you're like, I feel something, but it's also so weird that I'm feeling something. It's strange.
What the fuck is that? It just goes into your mouth.
Of course, these like letting your hair down moments, and this is where the fun conversations happen, and you get to laugh and joke around with your coworkers and put caviar and waffles from your freezer. I can personally say that I've had versions of this happen multiple times throughout my career in multiple cities that I've worked in. And so this is absolutely accurate in the way that chefs like to party. And you'll see that sometimes when people say, oh, this so-and-so is a chef and they're coming over to eat at my house and I'm super nervous to cook for them. It's like, please don't be nervous. The fact that the pressure's off and the fact that I don't have to cook is already enough. I'm just excited to enjoy the Budweiser beer and the Tombstone pizza that I did not have to prepare myself. Those toxic relationship dynamics where like nights like this bring you back in and you're like, man, I love the people. I love my coworkers. I love being a part of like having this network that is surrounding me and just having fun with these awesome people. Like the friends that I've made in the restaurant world are just some of the coolest people. And you also combat that with the fact that your day-to-day, like this is one day of your year that is going to be a highlight moment. And then you have 364 other days where you're going to have to slog through this thing that you're not excited about. And so you can have these like peaks and valleys in your experience. And yeah, it can be really hard when you have maybe mentally made a decision or told yourself that I'm going to give my notice and I'm going to move on to something else. And then you have this thing that is such a potent reminder of why you enjoy this. And it can be really hard. All right, folks, as we wrap up season 3, I just wanted to say thank you so much for watching and just your patience with these episodes. I'm going to get on to season 4 because it drops in the next hour and a half. I'm going to get this edited and out to you folks as soon as possible and then get right on to what I typically do with these seasons is just watch them through in their entirety so that I'm not putting my foot in my mouth on episode 2 about something that gets resolved in episode 9. And so I will make sure I have all of it watched, and then I will get right back into the breakdown videos. Hopefully, this next season is constructed in a way where I'm a little bit more excited about the episodes. I think season 3 was the season when I saw the most negative criticism of The Bear. I will share just some of my thoughts on that. I think that they were building up to this moment, the review dropping, for the entire season. And I thought that we were going to get some sort of like positive resolution, not even positive, just a resolution point at the end of the season. And this is what we're left with, is this cliffhanger. And so I just felt very empty getting to the end of the season. And also with some of the narrative stuff that I know add complexity and give characters more depth throughout the season is valuable. That makes my job hard when I'm trying to focus on the food elements. And yes, you have a couple of these things portrayed in earlier episodes of the season where they're talking about the mundane day-to-dayness of running a restaurant, which I'm not saying is bad. I just don't think that that's necessarily something that can make compelling TV for 10 different episodes. So I'm very excited to see what happens with season 4. Just, again, huge kudos to the entire team who I've either had a chance to meet in person or who frequently engage with the content that I make on the show. I've got a chance to have so many positive conversations with you folks, either in the comments or offline. If you've made it this far, please make sure to like and subscribe. My name is Justin Khanna, and I'll see you folks in season 4.